Hey guys, tonight we wander through the mist-draped hills of Wallachia, where every gust of wind sounds like a sigh from something that remembers more than you do, and every shadow seems to lean closer as if curious about what you're doing here at this hour. You probably won't survive this, but don't worry, it's only history. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're watching from, too. Drop your location and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You start by picturing a valley wrapped in twilight. Its air still thick with late summer humidity that clings to the back of your neck, and you swear you can taste iron in the breeze. The scent of wet earth, smoke, and pine needles mingles with something faintly metallic, like old coins left too long in a pocket. Somewhere in the distance, dogs bark, always in threes, as if the mountains have trained them to warn the living when stories are about to start. You follow a narrow dirt path that winds between stone crosses, most leaning at improbable angles, and it occurs to you that this landscape doesn't even need ghosts. It's already halfway there. Wallachia, the land that once served as a trembling buffer between the Ottoman Empire and the Hungarian crown, feels like a bruise on the map of medieval Europe, soft to the touch but hiding something sharp beneath. You glance toward the faint silhouette of a ruined tower, its jagged crown of stones outlined by the moon, and you imagine Vlad III, better known later by an unfortunate nickname, standing there, cloak pressed by the wind, thinking that the only way to keep his people safe was to make everyone else too terrified to approach. It's a strange moral logic that only medieval geopolitics could invent. You hear your boots crunch over gravel and think of how this same soil once soaked up the weight of armies, of envoys, of farmers who just wanted to keep their goats alive through another winter. Somewhere up ahead, you see a faint glow, a candle behind a shutter maybe, and you can almost convince yourself that if you knock, some villager will open the door and tell you, in a voice low and certain, that he's seen Vlad's ghost walk these ridges when the moon turns red. It's a good story, except that it's not really superstition. It's how people remember him, through fear so old it's become a kind of heritage. You walk past a wooden fence tied with horsehair charms meant to ward off the strigoi, and the absurdity makes you smile. Superstition doesn't vanish. It just gets rebranded for the next century. Somewhere in the thick silence, an owl calls out, and for a second the sound folds the present into the 15th century, when this was a frontier world ruled by shifting empires, brutal winters, and men who thought diplomacy was best conducted with torches. You think about how Vlad was born around 1431 in Transylvania, a region that, depending on whom you ask, was either Romanian, Hungarian, or God's private chessboard. His father, Vlad II Dracul, belonged to the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric fraternity sworn to defend Christendom against the Ottomans. The dragon emblem was meant to symbolize courage, though to the locals it sometimes meant trouble's coming. That dragon symbol, incidentally, gives us part of the name we whisper today, Dracula literally meaning son of the dragon. It's one of those linguistic coincidences history seems to enjoy far too much. You pass a half-collapsed watchtower and wonder if the man himself ever stood there, squinting across the plains toward Ottoman camps that glittered like embers in the night. You imagine him not as a monster, but as a man calculating impossible odds, one side demanding tribute, the other demanding loyalty, and both ready to destroy him for showing too much friendliness to the other. If you've ever tried to make everyone happy and failed spectacularly, congratulations, you already share something with medieval rulers. Somewhere near your feet, something metallic catches the moonlight. It's just a rusted horseshoe, but your pulse jumps anyway. The mind fills in legends faster than it fills in facts. And speaking of facts, here's one that's comfortably mainstream. The fortress of Poenari really did exist, perched high on a ridge overlooking the Artis River, rebuilt by Vlad using the labor of captured boyars who had rebelled against him. It wasn't the Gothic castle tourists imagine, but a grim, pragmatic fortification, a symbol of power balanced on the edge of a cliff. If you've ever wondered what kind of man orders traders to rebuild his stronghold, you can guess what kind of king he planned to be. The air feels heavier now, cooler, as you walk past the outline of what might be an old campfire circle. You half expect to find some scholar crouched there, muttering about how the real Vlad was a victim of political smear campaigns. After all, even among historians today, the debate still rages. Was he a national hero defending Christian Europe, or a tyrant whose paranoia devoured his own people? The phrase open scholarly debate doesn't usually sound dramatic, but here it feels like a ghost argument echoing through time. You lean against a moss-covered wall, feel the damp stone against your palm, and let that thought simmer. Somewhere between propaganda and preservation, Vlad turned into folklore's favorite villain. The night deepens, and the mist thickens like stage smoke. You can hear water dripping somewhere below, maybe from a spring or a collapsed tunnel. There's talk in the more eccentric corners of historical speculation, of hidden vaults beneath the castles, iron chains fastened into rock not for prisoners, but for something ceremonial, older than Christianity itself. Fringe theory? Absolutely. Fun to imagine. Even more so, you picture the clink of chains, the flicker of torches, the whisper of prayers spoken in a language that no one admits to remembering. The historian in you says nonsense, but the storyteller in you quietly hopes it's true. You cross a narrow bridge of uneven planks, each creak sounding like a question. How much of Vlad's cruelty was survival instinct, and how much was just reputation snowballing downhill through centuries of gossip? The line between the two is thinner than mist. Somewhere behind you, thunder mutters, or maybe it's just the mountains settling. You keep walking, tracing the outline of a history that refuses to stay still. The moon hangs low, fat and orange, and the valley looks like it's breathing, slow, uneven, alive. The wind shifts, carrying the scent of wild garlic and smoke from a distant farmhouse. And you realize you're shivering, not from cold, but from recognition. You're standing in a place where the idea of safety has always been conditional, where fear was once a tool of governance and now just a tourist attraction. A bat flits overhead, inevitable, really, and you laugh quietly, because even nature seems to enjoy cliches. You step closer to a low stone marker carved with Cyrillic letters, worn smooth by rain, and your flashlight, if you're cheating with modernity, picks up the faint engraving of a dragon. You whisper Dracule to yourself, just to hear how it feels in the dark, and for a moment it seems to answer. You wonder what it must have been like to grow up in a world where power meant promising peace with one hand, while sharpening a blade with the other. The villagers say Vlad could smell treachery in a man's sweat. The modern equivalent is probably just reading the room better than everyone else. You keep moving, downhill now, until you reach the edge of the forest where the fog pools like milk. Somewhere under your feet, there's the soft hum of underground rivers and maybe the faint echo of those fabled chains, imagined or otherwise. You pause, listen, and let your heartbeat sync with the rhythm of a place that's older than any story. The stars barely pierce through the haze, and your eyes adjust to darkness until even the outlines of trees begin to seem deliberate. Like an old script you can almost read. The night doesn't feel threatening anymore, just vast and aware. And as you breathe in that damp, metallic air one more time, you realize the story hasn't even started. It's been waiting for you to arrive, to listen, to imagine what still clinks beneath the castles of Vlad the Impaler Dot. You wake to the sound of a rooster somewhere far below the castle walls, a thin, uncertain crow that sounds more like a question than a start to the day, and for a moment you forget whether you're supposed to be in the present or the 15th century, until the smell of damp stone and wood smoke reminds you that you've wandered too far into history to care about time. The morning mist curls around the parapets of Sigisoara, that tiny Transylvanian town where Vlad was born in 1431, when the world still believed dragons guarded faith and a man's worth was measured in loyalty and scars. You walk through the cobbled streets, past the leaning yellow house where local guides say the Dracul family once lived, though half of them admit quietly that no one's entirely sure. Still, it's easier to imagine a cradle rocking by candlelight than to confront the ambiguity of medieval record-keeping, so you let your mind fill in the blanks. The flicker of tallow candles on plastered walls, the slow rhythm of a mother's lullaby blending with the far-off clang of blacksmiths. You picture baby Vlad wrapped in linen, already scowling like someone who suspects the world is planning something unfair. You can almost hear the priest murmuring a baptismal prayer over him, promising protection that, frankly, would expire faster than medieval bread. The air carries that faint metallic tang again, the same scent from last night, and it feels symbolic, like the world already knew blood and iron would be his inheritance. His father, Vlad II Dracul, was away most of the time, maneuvering through the treacherous politics of the Order of the Dragon, that elite club of noblemen sworn to defend Christendom against the Ottomans. Imagine an exclusive medieval fraternity, but with fewer parties and more decapitations. The Order's emblem, a coiled dragon biting its own tail, was proudly displayed on armor and seals, though to superstitious peasants it probably looked like a demon audition. You step into a tiny chapel, now half museum, half shrine, where tourists whisper, as if afraid to wake the ghosts of diplomacy gone wrong. A guide points at a faded mural of St. George slaying a serpent, and insists that's where the Dracul legend began, though historians shrug. It might just be a coincidence of timing and imagination. What's certain is that young Vlad inherited not just his father's title, but also a region perpetually trapped between empires, Hungary pressing from the west, the Ottomans from the east, each demanding loyalty and tribute. It's a bit like being born with two landlords who both claim you owe back rent. You lean on the stone railing of the clock tower, looking out across the red-tiled roofs toward the river valley, and think about how this delicate balance of power would shape every thought Vlad ever had. You wonder what kind of childhood produces someone later accused of cruelty and brilliance in equal measure. Probably one filled with swords instead of toys, tutors who taught that mercy was expensive, and priests who warned that hesitation was a sin. There's a story, half fact, half folklore, that as a child Vlad watched his father order executions for treason and didn't flinch. Some scholars argue that's propaganda from later enemies, others that it was just Tuesday in medieval Wallachia. The open scholarly debate continues, tangled like vines over a forgotten tomb. What's clear is that he learned early that fear worked faster than forgiveness, and in the chessboard politics of the 15th century, speed was survival. You wander down an alley where merchants once sold spices and steel, and the smell of roasting chestnuts from a modern cart briefly breaks the illusion before blending back into history as if the centuries had agreed to share the same air. Somewhere behind you, a bell tolls noon, and its echo bounces through narrow streets that seem too small for time. You imagine the young prince learning to ride, his small frame perched awkwardly on a horse too big for him. The instructors yelling, the cold air biting through layers of wool. Maybe he fell often. Maybe he didn't. Maybe that's where the habit of getting back up, furious and silent, first began. You think about how the name Vlad meant something ordinary once, just a boy's name whispered by a mother. It would take a lifetime of betrayal and war to turn it into an omen. The sky darkens a little as you reach the citadel's gate, the same kind of gate through which soldiers once marched to their deaths, and you can almost feel the weight of expectation that came with being the son of a man who owed allegiance to dragons. You pause near a wooden sign explaining how Vlad's father ruled briefly as voivode before being dethroned, reinstated, and ultimately murdered by political rivals in 1447. You picture that moment. The shock, the realization that inheritance here meant inheriting enemies. A boy of 16, far from home, learning that the world had just erased his father with paperwork and daggers. It's no wonder that when he later regained power, forgiveness didn't make the list of policies. You step back from the plaque and imagine the teenager swearing in the dark that he'd reclaim everything stolen from him, even if he had to rebuild Wallachia brick by brick, bone by bone. There's something both admirable and terrifying about that kind of resolve, half hero's vow, half villain's origin story. The wind picks up, carrying with it the sound of distant laughter from a cafe somewhere in the modern town, and you realize how easily the centuries overlap. One moment you're surrounded by medieval tension, the next by espresso machines. It's almost poetic that the birthplace of one of history's most feared rulers now serves cappuccinos named Dracula Latte. You smile at the absurdity. History loves irony. But behind the humor lingers a truth. Even here, his story feels unsettled, as if the walls remember both pride and horror. A local historian once told you that Vlad's birth record might never be verified. The archives burned, rewritten, retranslated too many times. Wallachia, he said, was always a place where facts arrived late. You like that line. It feels like something Vlad himself might have said while plotting revenge under candlelight. You step outside the citadel walls and look back one last time, the yellow house glowing faintly against the dusk, and you can almost hear a baby's cry echoing through the centuries. Maybe it's the wind, or maybe it's the past still refusing to sleep. You walk downhill through the orchard paths, where apples lie crushed underfoot, and the air smells faintly of cider and soil. A shepherd passes with his flock, nodding once, and you wonder how many generations have told this story differently, some making Vlad a hero of resistance, others a cautionary tale of obsession. Either way, his birth feels less like a beginning, and more like a trigger pulled centuries ago. The sun sets behind the Carpathians, and the shadows lengthen, wrapping around the hills like velvet ropes. You keep walking, your footsteps slow, your breath steady, the chill deepening with every step. Somewhere ahead, a crow lands on a post and tilts its head, watching you, as if waiting to see which version of the story you'll believe. In that gaze, you find the perfect summary of this land, a mix of suspicion and endurance, history and rumor, fear and faith. You whisper Dracule again, just to test the air, and it seems softer now, less monstrous, almost noble. Maybe names, like legends, only grow teeth when people stop questioning them. The night hums with cicadas. The stars sharpen above you, and you feel the weight of centuries pressing gently on your shoulders. Every tale has to start somewhere, and this one began with a birth that would split history down its middle. A baby wrapped in linen, a dragon on a banner, and a world already preparing to misunderstand him. You follow the sound of hooves on frozen ground, the echo carrying across the plains as the scene shifts from the quiet alleys of Sigisawara to the wide, wind-swept horizon of the Ottoman frontier, where politics had teeth and every alliance came with a receipt. You picture a teenage Vlad, barely 15, bundled in a heavy cloak that smells of wet wool and uncertainty, glancing back one last time at his homeland as the Ottoman envoys escort him and his younger brother Radu toward Edirne, the imperial city that would serve as their gilded cage. You imagine the journey taking weeks, the horses trudging through mud and snow, the sky changing colors like a moody god, deciding what kind of day this will be. Each campfire smells of pine resin and roasting meat, but the boys eat little, too aware that they're no longer guests but bargaining chips in the hands of empires that measured loyalty in hostages. You walk beside them in your imagination, the crunch of snow beneath your boots matching the rhythm of the guards marching, and you realize how young they really are. Children trapped in a chess match their father started. The Ottomans call it diplomacy. The Wallachians call it insurance. History just calls it Tuesday in the 15th century. Edirne greets them with gold-domed roofs and the scent of cinnamon, horses, and sea wind drifting up from the Marmara. The city hums with contradictions, scholars and janissaries, prayer calls and executions, silk markets and iron chains. And Vlad, sharp-eyed and silent, absorbs everything. It's said that he learned Turkish fluently within months, listened more than he spoke, and smiled less than he should. One contemporary wrote that his stare unsettled even men twice his age, which is historians speak for, don't make eye contact if you value your composure. The Ottomans intended the stay to be educational, a kind of elite hostage exchange program with lessons in etiquette, politics, and the art of survival. But for Vlad, it became an apprenticeship in control. While his brother, Radu, adapted easily, charming tutors and courtiers alike, Vlad stood apart, a shadow among chandeliers. You can almost see him standing in the courtyard of the imperial palace, practicing sword forms until his knuckles bled, whispering oaths to the cold stone walls. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Between 1442 and 1448, both Vlad and Radu were indeed held as political hostages at the Ottoman court under Sultan Murad II, later under the young Mehmed II, the same Mehmed who would one day conquer Constantinople. The idea was simple: keep the sons close so the father behaved. It's like medieval parenting advice meets global politics. Vlad's father, meanwhile, played a double game, sometimes siding with the Ottomans, sometimes with Hungary, until both sides stopped trusting him entirely, which, if you've ever tried to please two bosses with conflicting orders, you can probably empathize with. But for Vlad, those years of captivity weren't just punishment. They were education in power stripped of illusion. One evening, as you imagine it, the muezzin's call drifts over the city and the marble courtyards blush with sunset. Vlad walks along the colonnade, trailing his fingers along the cool stone, watching janissaries drill with mathematical precision. He studies how they move, how they obey, how their discipline is rooted not in fear but in faith and conditioning. He files it away like an accountant of vengeance. Beside him, Radu laughs with another page boy, light-hearted, adjusting to the rhythm of court life. You sense the first fissure between brothers. Not yet hatred, but the quiet realization that they are learning opposite lessons. Radu learns charm. Vlad learns distance. You stand in that tension, the way the night air trembles just before a storm. There's a fringe tidbit, one of those half-wild theories whispered in old academic journals, that claims Vlad's early fascination with punishment methods came not from Wallachia, but from stories told in Edirne, where he witnessed impalements used as imperial spectacle. It's impossible to verify, of course, but it fits the poetic logic of history. The prisoner learning the art of terror from his captors, only to perfect it later. Scholars argue endlessly. Did he adopt the Ottoman model, or twist it into something uniquely his own? Open scholarly debate, as usual, thrives wherever facts fade. You think of it not as a question of cruelty, but of mimicry. After all, a hostage learns survival by observation. If your teacher is an empire, your homework is fear. The sound of a fountain fills the air. Steady, hypnotic, and you picture him staring into the rippling water, imagining the reflection of Wallachia somewhere beyond the horizon. He writes secret notes in the margins of borrowed manuscripts, sketches maps of rivers and fortresses, memorizes troop formations from overheard conversations. The Ottomans see a compliant guest. He's actually studying escape routes. He attends lessons in philosophy and military tactics, listens to sermons about mercy and divine justice, and files them away under probably optional. You sense his intellect sharpening, the way a knife edge finds itself through constant use. Every insult he swallows, every humiliation he endures, becomes a future brick in the fortress of his patience. Years pass, and the boy hardens into a man. His posture straightens, his eyes grow colder, and his voice lowers into that unsettling calm of someone whose decided emotion is a luxury. He's sparring matches with janissaries twice his size and wins by being unpredictable. He stops reacting to threats, and that unnerves people more than anger ever could. You can almost feel the slow burn of purpose in his chest, like a coal refusing to go out. At night he lies awake, counting not sheep, but grudges, each one a promise to himself. You think of all the hostages in history who broke. Vlad was the rare one who grew sharper in captivity, like glass under pressure. One afternoon, while walking through the palace gardens, a maze of fountains and cypress trees, you catch him noticing how the Sultan's advisors kneel slightly lower than they need to, how every gesture is choreographed hierarchy. It's not loyalty that holds empires together, he realizes. It's choreography. Later, he'll apply the same principle to his own court, turning ceremony into a weapon. But for now, he just watches, memorizing the script. Somewhere beyond the courtyard, drums begin to beat, announcing the Sultan's arrival. Radu rushes ahead, eager to please, while Vlad lingers in the shade. You wonder what he's thinking. Maybe about home, or revenge, or whether he'll ever step on Wallachian soil again. Eventually, the news comes. His father is dead, murdered by boyars, his elder brother buried alive. You imagine that moment like a blade drawn through silk, quiet, clean, devastating. The guards watch his face for reaction. None comes. But later that night, in the privacy of his chamber, he digs his fingernails into the wooden table until blood stains the grain. That's the night Vlad the captive begins turning into Vlad the ruler. Every chain feels lighter once you decide you'll forge your own. You walk with him again through Edirne's streets, the air filled with the smell of roasted lamb and resin torches, the sky shimmering above the mosque domes. Merchants shout in a dozen languages, and he understands half of them now. Somewhere a storyteller recites the legend of Alexander the Great, and Vlad listens, not for entertainment, but for instruction. You realize he's already rehearsing how his own story will sound when told centuries later. He doesn't know he'll become a monster in Western pamphlets or a hero in Romanian ballads. He only knows that one day he will stop being a pawn. When his release finally comes, perhaps through negotiation, perhaps through the Ottomans, realizing a vengeful Wallachian prince might be more useful on the throne than in their dungeons, it feels almost anticlimactic. You can picture him riding out of the gates, the same road he arrived on, the wind colder now, his eyes unblinking. He's not going home as a boy who was taken. He's going home as a man who learned how the world truly works. The chains that once held him have become internal. Discipline, suspicion, precision, and he'll never set them down. As you follow the road out of Edirne, the soundscape shifts again. The city fading behind you, replaced by the whisper of grasslands and the faint creak of saddles. You glance back once, the way he might have, seeing the domes recede into haze, and think how strange it is that captivity could be both a wound and a blueprint. You imagine him glancing at his younger brother, who's still humming a Turkish tune under his breath, unaware that they'll soon stand on opposite sides of history. Vlad doesn't say anything. He doesn't need to. Silence has always been his favorite punctuation. The road dips toward the Danube, the sun setting in the bands of amber and rust, and for a moment you feel a flicker of empathy for the boy who became a lesson in legend. You realize that, in his mind, cruelty and control were synonyms for safety, the language of an age when survival demanded theater. You wonder if the chains beneath the castles were ever literal, or if they were the invisible ones people like Vlad carried forever, the kind forged in other people's wars. The wind rises, carrying the distant sound of wolves, or maybe applause from the ghosts of empires, and you keep walking, the night folding around you, the air thick with that same metallic tang of blood, iron, and inevitability. You come back to Wallachia the way a scar returns to the surface, slowly, inevitably, and with just enough sting to remind you that healing and vengeance are cousins who never get along. The road from Edirne to Targovista feels longer now, though maybe that's because it's less about distance and more about crossing into the memory of what used to be home. The land greets you with fog that seems to rise from the soil itself, thick and stubborn, as if trying to hide the damage. You walk through fields where the stalks are brittle, where old battle flags hang limp on broken poles, and you realize the wars haven't stopped, only paused long enough to reload. You breathe in smoke, manure, and frost, the holy trinity of medieval survival, and listen to the faint clatter of wooden wheels somewhere beyond the ridge. A farmer passes you, pushing a cart stacked with turnips, and gives you the polite nod reserved for travelers who might be dangerous. That's the thing about Wallachia. Everyone's polite because everyone's terrified. The first thing you notice is how thin the villages look. Roofs sag, wells stand dry, and chickens seem to have developed trust issues. You stop at one small cottage where an old woman tends a pot of cabbage stew and ask her about the state of things. She doesn't look up when she answers, just stirs and mutters. Too many taxes, not enough miracles. It's a fair summary of 15th century economics. You hand her a coin and she crosses herself 3 times, the way people do when they suspect they've just met history disguised as a stranger. You keep walking, following the muddy path toward the capital, where the rumors say the boyars have grown fat off foreign bribes, trading loyalty to whichever empire paid better that month. The forests press in from both sides, dark and whispering. Somewhere in the undergrowth, wolves watch you pass, their eyes reflecting firelight that isn't there. You can't tell if it's imagination or memory that keeps this country haunted. Targo Vist rises from the mist like a wounded fortress, crumbling walls, half-burned gates, and towers leaning as though exhausted from centuries of intrigue. You picture young Vlad riding in under the same winter sky, his cloak stiff with frost, his eyes sharper than the pikes that line the walls. He's not returning as the grateful son of Wallachia. He's returning as its judge. You imagine him pausing at the city gate, taking in the silence, realizing that the boyars who betrayed his father still sit inside drinking imported wine. The guards at the gate hesitate to announce him, not sure whether to bow or run. You step beside him in the story, feeling that quiet fury rolling off him like heat from iron. When he finally rides through the gates, the crowd parts, not out of love, but curiosity. The same way you'd watch a storm approach. Here's your mainstream historical fact. After years in Ottoman custody, Vlad briefly reclaimed the Wallachian throne in 1448 with Ottoman support, lost it almost immediately to rivals, and spent years plotting his return. It wasn't until 1456 that he secured lasting control, backed by Hungarian forces under John Hunyadi. The timeline is messy, like all good revenge stories, but it proves one thing. He was persistent to the point of obsession. You can almost admire the consistency. If persistence were an Olympic sport, Vlad would have been too busy sharpening the medals to wear them. When he steps into the royal court again, the boyars greet him with the kind of smiles that say, "We killed your father, but hope you've moved on." The banquet is lavish. Roast goose, honeyed wine, imported figs, and the music sounds cheerful if you don't listen too closely. You stand by the wall, watching the flicker of torches on polished armor, and imagine the tension so thick you could slice it with a dagger. Vlad raises a cup, toasts to loyalty, and everyone drinks because that's safer than not drinking. He thanks them for their service to Wallachia, then calmly orders the doors barred. You don't need to imagine the rest. Even the mildest versions of history record that he punished the conspirators who killed his father. Some he executed, some he forced to march to Puanari Castle to rebuild it stone by stone. It's not revenge, he'd argue. It's labor reform with extra motivation. There's a quirky historical tidbit that one surviving account claims the younger servants sent to Puanari actually enjoyed the mountain air, even composing work songs that mocked their noble masters dying beside them. Whether that's true or just folklore trying to make sense of horror, it's the kind of detail that makes you wonder if medieval peasants invented dark humor centuries before Twitter. You follow the path from the capital toward the foothills, where the fortress rises like a jagged tooth above the Argus River. The climb is steep, the kind that turns legs to fire and lungs to steam. You imagine the boyars gasping under loads of stone, their silk sleeves shredded, the sound of hammers echoing off cliffs. Vlad watches from above, impassive, the wind whipping his cloak, his face unreadable. In that moment, he is not just rebuilding a fortress, he's rebuilding control. Every stone laid is a reminder that loyalty is not inherited. It's manufactured through exhaustion and fear. Standing on those cliffs today, the view stretches across endless green valleys, deceptively peaceful. You close your eyes and hear the creak of pulleys, the curses of men who once swore allegiance and broke it. You think about how power always seems to require the same building materials: stone, sweat, and a few good grudges. The fortress of Poenari, historians tell us, was one of Vlad's strategic masterpieces, a defensive stronghold overlooking key trade routes. It wasn't luxurious, but it didn't need to be. It was a statement carved into the mountain itself. A fortress doesn't apologize, and neither did he. As months pass, Vlad begins reordering Wallachia like a frustrated architect redesigning someone else's disaster. He enforces new laws, harsh, efficient, often bizarre. One legend says he left a golden cup by a public fountain so travelers could drink, and no one ever dared steal it. Not because they were virtuous, but because the punishment for theft was an early retirement 6 feet under. Fear, as it turns out, is a more reliable form of security than faith. You stroll through the ruins of an old marketplace and imagine those laws in action. Merchants counting coins twice, farmers whispering prayers over their livestock, tax collectors pretending to like their jobs. Vlad's rule wasn't kind, but it worked. Trade resumed, roads cleared, and crime nearly vanished. The price was terror, but at least it was well-organized terror. The scholars still argue whether he was a sadist or a strategist. The open, scholarly debate runs like an underground river beneath every biography. Some say he was simply enforcing order in a chaotic land. Others claim he reveled in cruelty. You suspect the truth sits somewhere inconveniently between the two, sipping wine and smirking. You walk through what used to be the royal courtyard, the air smelling faintly of rain and horses, and you can almost see him pacing there at night, staring at the horizon, muttering calculations. His kingdom is functional now, but fragile, held together by discipline and rumor. You can tell he knows it. Ruling Wallachia is like keeping a wolf on a leash. Effective, but only if you never let go. One night, as the fires burn low, Vlad rides out beyond the walls, through forests that rustle with unseen eyes. He stops at a river crossing where a bridge once stood, destroyed during one of the many border skirmishes. You stand beside him in the darkness, listening to the water gurgle over stones. The moon catches his reflection. Young still, but already carrying the exhaustion of 10 lifetimes. You imagine him whispering to the river, promising his father's ghost that he'll never let Wallachia bend again. The wind answers in creaks and sighs, as if the land itself understands the vow. Morning brings news of another rebellion. Always another. This time, nobles aligned with Hungary challenge his authority, while Ottoman envoys demand tribute. It's the kind of geopolitical tug-of-war that would make anyone develop trust issues. You see him at his desk, surrounded by maps, red lines crisscrossing mountains like veins. His hand hovers over the parchment, ink blotting where patience runs thin. You imagine his advisors urging moderation, diplomacy, compromise. He listens, nods once, and then orders the fortresses reinforced. Compromise, to him, is just surrender wearing a fancy hat. You leave the court and walk through the village outskirts, where people still tell stories by firelight. An old man with a pipe insists that Vlad was fair if you behaved, cruel only to liars. A woman selling bread nods in agreement, but adds that the forests near Poenari still echo at night, as if the stones remember screams. You realize both can be true. Justice and terror often share a border that maps refuse to draw. You buy a loaf from her, and she wraps it carefully, saying, "Eat before it cools." Cold bread invites ghosts. You take a bite. It tastes like smoke and salt and a little bit of history. The road turns west, leading toward the Carpathians, and you stop at a ridge overlooking the plains. From here, Wallachia stretches like a patchwork quilt. Fields, rivers, ruins, and fog stitched together by survival. The sky deepens to violet, the kind of dusk that feels painted rather than real. You think of Vlad standing here centuries ago, watching the same horizon, calculating his next move. Behind him, a country rebuilding. Ahead, a world waiting to test him again. You can almost hear the faint clinking of unseen chains beneath the soil. The legacy of every decision he made, tightening its hold on the land. You take one last look at the valley, the ruins glowing faintly in the fading light, and realize that this isn't a story about monsters or heroes. It's about how both wear the same crown when the kingdom's falling apart. The mist rises again, soft and silver, swallowing the roads, the towers, even the memories, until only the whisper of iron and the echo of footsteps remain. You pull your cloak tighter, listening to the night, knowing the story is only just beginning its darker descent, and somewhere deep beneath those castle foundations, something, maybe history itself, shifts in its chains. You wake before dawn to the sound of wind scraping along the stone walls of Poenari, and for a moment in the gray half-light, the fortress feels less like a building and more like a living thing breathing in its sleep. You stand on the parapet where the cold bites through your coat, and the view stretches endlessly. Forests stitched together with fog, rivers like thin silver veins, and the sharp edges of mountains slicing through the sky. This is the view Vlad the Impaler woke to most mornings, and if you squint, you can almost see his mind at work in the landscape. Order imposed upon chaos, geometry drawn against wilderness. You realize, not for the first time, that some men don't build castles just to defend themselves. They build them because the world outside refuses to make sense until it's contained by walls. You walk the length of the battlements, boots clanging against stone, your breath visible like smoke. And imagine Vlad doing the same centuries earlier, surveying, planning, never sleeping easily. The fortress, in many ways, was an extension of him, severe, strategic, and slightly paranoid in design. Each stairwell curves just enough to slow an enemy. Each window is narrow enough to let in light, but not weakness. You can't help but admire the precision of it all, the way architecture becomes autobiography. You remember the historians who called him the fortress mind, meaning not just his obsession with defense, but his tendency to live psychologically behind walls. Even his closest advisors, it said, never really knew what he was thinking. You walk past the crumbled archway that once led to his private chamber and imagine him there, sitting by a narrow window, writing letters to foreign courts, his handwriting small, tight, exacting, like someone afraid of wasting ink or trust. Outside, thunder growls far away over the Carpathians, a reminder that the weather here doesn't obey politics. You lean on the cold stone and think about the balance Vlad had to keep. His people hungry for stability, his enemies circling like wolves, and his so-called allies plotting in candlelit rooms across the border. The pressure of that reality would have crushed most rulers, but he thrived on it. almost enjoyed it, as if danger sharpened his focus. His mind, you suspect, was its own fortress. No window too wide, no gate left open. And maybe that's why his legend endured. Not because he was cruel, but because he was deliberate in a world addicted to chaos. You climb down into what's left of the great hall. The air smells of damp stone and dust, and you can still see faint traces of frescoes under centuries of grime. Faded reds and ochres forming ghostly shapes that might once have been saints or soldiers. You picture the banquets that used to take place here, long wooden tables, flickering candles, the heavy silence that fell whenever he entered the room. There's a story, half believable, that he could silence an entire court with a single look. Another says he once invited his nobles to dinner, asked how loyal they were, and when one hesitated, the man simply disappeared before dessert. You can debate whether these are facts or theater, but in a world where power depended on performance, Vlad understood that perception was armor. You trace your fingers along a groove in the wall where iron chains once hung, and it's easy to imagine prisoners down here, not necessarily tortured but contained. Reminders to anyone above that order was a choice enforced by vigilance. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Vlad maintained a network of fortresses and watchtowers across Wallachia, a defensive system that allowed him to anticipate invasions long before they reached his borders. He communicated through coded messages delivered by horsemen and fire signals, an early form of military telegraphy that made his territory almost impossible to surprise. It wasn't cruelty that built this system, it was obsession. The Ottomans, for all their power, respected his discipline enough to call him Kazikli Bey, the Impaler Lord, a name meant to frighten, but perhaps also to acknowledge efficiency. You sit on a loose stone and let the rain begin to fall, soft at first, then steady, the droplets darkening your sleeves. You think about the kind of loneliness that must come with ruling through fear. Power keeps you safe, but it also makes you untouchable. Imagine being a man who couldn't risk friendship because friendship invited betrayal, who couldn't trust priests because God's will changed with politics, who couldn't sleep soundly because sleep itself was an opportunity for assassination. You wonder if that's why he built his life like a fortress, high, cold, impenetrable. Even the walls seem tired of keeping secrets. There's a quirky tidbit some local historians love to repeat. Vlad allegedly kept a room lined entirely with maps, strings connecting fortresses, supply routes, and villages like a medieval detective board. He would stand there for hours, murmuring to himself, rearranging tiny figurines carved from bone to represent armies. One visitor wrote that he never saw Vlad sit while thinking, only pace in circles like a wolf in captivity. If true, it makes sense. Sitting still means surrender. Movement is control. You can picture him, candlelight dancing on his armor, eyes glinting like a man negotiating with the ghosts of strategy itself. The fortress groans as the wind strengthens, rattling the old timbers, and you think about how the human brain isn't so different from these walls. Solid at first, but eventually everything leaks. The scholars who study him, psychologists, historians, even political theorists, still debate what drove him. Some argue trauma, others ideology, a few suggest sheer pragmatism. The open, scholarly debate usually ends in the same stalemate. Was he a genius or a madman? You smile because you know that history rarely rewards nuance. We like our villains monstrous and our heroes tragic. Vlad refuses to stay in either costume for long. You wander into the courtyard where rain collects in shallow puddles, reflecting the jagged silhouette of the keep. A crow lands on the wall, cocks its head, and watches you, as if to remind you that observation is its own kind of rule. The sky cracks with lightning, illuminating the entire valley for a heartbeat, and in that flash you understand the strange appeal of isolation. From up here you see everything, every road, every threat, every chance to stay alive another day. Down there, in the villages, people live and die in ignorance. Up here you control the story. It's tempting, this altitude of power. You can almost forgive him for mistaking control for peace. You walk back inside, down a spiral staircase slick with rain, and find yourself in the storage chamber. Now, just rubble, but once filled with grain, salt, weapons, and barrels of wine. A single candle, lit by some tourist before you, flickers weakly in a niche. The flame trembles, barely surviving the drafts. You realize that must have been what leadership felt like in Wallachia. Holding a candle in a windstorm, hoping the wax doesn't melt faster than you can rebuild. You kneel beside it, cupping your hand around the flame, and whisper a line that might have belonged to Vlad himself. If fear keeps them loyal, let it be fear of failure, not of me. Whether he ever said it doesn't matter. It fits at the tone of a man who understood that loyalty without purpose was just another chain waiting to snap. You climb higher again, back to the tower, where the wind hits harder and the horizon glows faintly with dawn. You picture messengers riding out at this hour centuries ago, carrying orders sealed with wax bearing the dragon emblem. Each one a fragment of his will, a command stretching across the land like nerve impulses through a living body. Maybe that's what Wallachia was to him, a body he had to keep alive through pain. You recall that he introduced strict punishments for corruption, punished merchants who cheated weights, and personally oversaw the distribution of relief after harsh winters. It's easy to miss the administrative brilliance buried under the fear propaganda. He wasn't trying to destroy his people. He was trying to rebuild a system that didn't already know how to behave. Discipline was the only language everyone understood. The sun, finally, cuts through the clouds, spilling weak light over the mountains. Steam rises from the wet stones, and for a moment, the entire fortress seems to breathe again. You stand there, eyes closed, listening to the steady rhythm of wind and dripping water. You think about how fortresses outlast kings, but always remember them. The stones don't care about politics, but they store emotion like old lungs. Inhale war, exhale silence. And somewhere beneath your feet, water trickles through the ancient drainage channels, carrying the echoes of centuries into the river below. You wonder if sound can become memory, if the clink of chains or the echo of bootsteps might still linger like a pulse under the mountain. You step back toward the gatehouse, where the air smells faintly of rust and pine, and you can almost hear the clatter of armor as guards once shifted at their posts. Vlad would have passed through here daily, issuing orders, inspecting defenses, questioning servants about supplies, every movement rehearsed, every gesture deliberate. The fortress mind again, always planning, never pausing. You remember something one scholar once said. Vlad didn't trust time to behave, so he tried to control it. You think about that for a while, staring at the watchtower's shadow stretching long across the valley. Control time. What a ridiculous, beautiful ambition. The rain stops, the wind softens. A shaft of sunlight pierces through the clouds and lands on the flagstones beside you. The warmth surprises you, like the world has decided to forgive itself for a second. You take a deep breath and feel the air clear in your chest. For all its violence and paranoia, there's something serene about this place. Maybe that's the paradox. Fortresses are built out of fear, but always end up offering peace to those who survive them. Before you leave, you glance back once more. The walls glisten under the morning light, moss catching tiny rainbows, the mountains behind them shrouded in mist. You think of Vlad walking this same path, his boots heavier than yours, his heart probably quieter. A man who trusted stone more than people, who saw walls not as barriers but as promises, to himself, to his father's ghost, to a country too fragile to stand on its own. You realize that the fortress mind isn't just about paranoia or power, it's about endurance, about building something so strong that even centuries later, strangers like you can still feel its pulse under their feet. You begin your descent down the cliffside stairs, 1,480 steps twisting through the forest. Each one feels like a meditation, a heartbeat, a history lesson. The air smells of pine and wet earth, and the distant river murmurs below. You can almost hear his voice riding the wind, measured, calm, unyielding, reminding you that in his world, survival was an architecture of the soul. By the time you reach the bottom, your legs burn and your lungs ache. But you understand why he built so high. Not just to see enemies coming, but to remind himself that power, like the climb, always demands breath, balance, and the refusal to stop. You glance up at the fortress one last time. It doesn't wave, it doesn't bow, it just watches. Silent, complete, eternal. The mind of Vlad made into stone. The climb to Poenari Castle leaves you gasping, each step carved into the mountainside like a test of loyalty, and by the time you reach the top, your legs feel like medieval poetry, tragic, dramatic, and slightly unnecessary. The mist rolls in thick from the Argus River Valley, curling around the cliffs like it's trying to reclaim the stones for itself. You stop to catch your breath and lean on the outer wall, your palm touching cold rock that feels more bone than earth. From here, the world below looks unreal. Forests stretching endlessly, rivers glinting like veins of mercury, the horizon bruised purple by dusk. And beneath your boots, you know it's not just stone holding this mountain together. Somewhere deep underfoot, if the legends are right, there are chains. Not metaphorical ones, the old iron kind, black with rust and rumor. You remember hearing a guide whisper that beneath Poenari lie the remains of tunnels and caverns, some natural, some carved by hand, some so deep that when you drop a stone, it never answers back. You descend into one of those tunnels, the entrance barely visible behind a collapsed stairway. The air changes instantly, cooler, heavier, flavored with dust and secrets. You move slowly, flashlight beam slicing through cobwebs, and the walls glisten with damp. It smells like wet iron, like history refusing to dry out. Every step echoes twice, once for you and once for the past. You try to imagine this place centuries ago, torches flickering, the sound of boots and breath mixing with the rattle of chains. Maybe they were storage tunnels, maybe prisons, or maybe something stranger. Ritual spaces for men who believed that fear itself could be consecrated. You run your hand along the wall and feel faint carvings, circles, crosses, dragon shapes, and realize that superstition was architecture's favorite assistant. There's a mainstream historical fact that grounds all this myth. The real Poenari Fortress does indeed contain hidden chambers and substructures built directly into the rock. Archaeologists have found metal hooks driven into the stone, possibly for securing supplies, or, as the more imaginative guides insist, for holding captives. The records are vague, as they always are when history prefers dramatic lighting over clarity. You stop beside one such hook, cold and pitted with age, and wonder whether it held a lantern, a weapon, or a man. You don't want to know which answer would make you feel worse. The wind moans faintly through the cracks in the rock, a sound that could easily pass for voices if you let your imagination off its leash. You think about Vlad walking through these tunnels, perhaps inspecting them by torchlight, his boots splashing in the same shallow puddles, the flames painting his face in trembling gold. He would have seen the fortress above as armor, but this underground, felt like the spine. He wasn't the kind of ruler who relied on luck. He relied on fear, geometry, and geography. The tunnels gave him all three. They connected Poenari to escape routes, storage vaults, and, if the rumors are true, something like a personal archive of loyalty. Not documents, but people. You picture a boyar chained to the wall, not tortured, not starved, just left to think about obedience until it hurt. The silence here is the kind that rearranges thoughts. You keep walking deeper, crouching now as the ceiling drops lower and the air becomes almost too thick to breathe. You remind yourself this is just history, not horror, but the line between the two has never been particularly clear in Wallachia. There's a quirky tidbit from local folklore that says the tunnels under Poenari once connected to sacred springs used by pre-Christian cults, long before Vlad's time, before even the Romans, when the mountain was a site of ritual purification. The villagers call it the belly of the dragon. No one's ever proven it, but it's exactly the kind of myth that Vlad might have enjoyed keeping alive. Power feeds on mystery, and a ruler who can make people fear both God and geology has already won half the battle. You find a wooden door halfway rotted away, its hinges red with rust. When you push it open, the creak sounds too human, like a sigh from someone who's waited centuries to be noticed. The chamber beyond is circular, maybe 20 feet across, the walls lined with more of those iron rings. Water drips from the ceiling in slow, steady rhythm. You can almost hear it forming words if you stand still long enough. It's not hard to imagine Vlad here, alone, thinking, not raging, not scheming, just thinking. The fortress mind again, now underground. You wonder if he came here to remember his father's death or to make peace with his own legend before it began. Or maybe, more practically, he came here to ensure that when the Ottomans came, he'd already built the kind of trap that could outlast a siege. There's something almost tender about the silence. You sit on a stone ledge and breathe in the cold air, listening to your heartbeat echo off the walls. You think about how leadership, especially in his time, meant isolation so total that the only voices you trusted were the ones you invented. Maybe that's what the chains were for, not prisoners, but metaphors in metal, reminders that control was never free. The mind that builds a fortress also builds its own captivity. You glance up at the ceiling, where water glitters in candlelight, and think of how the same man who terrified empires might have sat here one night counting drips instead of soldiers. You start to climb upward again, following a different passage that spirals like a corkscrew. Your flashlight catches something glinting ahead. Iron again, but newer. A preservation team's chain barrier, meant to stop tourists from wandering too far. You laugh softly, the irony not lost on you. Centuries later, we're still using chains to control curiosity. You step around it anyway, because rules feel different when you are surrounded by ghosts. The tunnel opens into a narrow shaft leading upward toward faint daylight. The air warms slightly, carrying the scent of pine. You pull yourself through, brushing dirt from your clothes, and find yourself outside on a narrow ledge overlooking the valley. The wind hits you hard, nearly stealing your balance, and for a moment you understand why this fortress feels so alive. It's not just stone and memory, it's defiance in solid form. The view spreads out below like a map of consequences. You can see the river curling around the base of the mountain, villages scattered like dice, smoke curling from distant hearths. Somewhere down there, people once told each other that their prince lived above them like a dragon in his lair, guarding them from enemies by scaring them half to death. It wasn't an exaggeration, it was policy. Vlad understood that power wasn't about distance, it was about altitude. Whoever controls the high ground, both literal and psychological, writes the rules. You think about how every empire that ever tried to control this land, from the Romans to the Ottomans to the Hungarians, learned that lesson the hard way. Wallachia doesn't surrender, it just waits. There's another scholarly debate that refuses to die. Were the chains beneath Poenari real instruments of imprisonment, or later inventions of folklore? Some researchers argue that the tales were exaggerated by foreign pamphlets during the 16th century. Those early tabloid versions of history meant to sell shock value to Western readers fascinated by the cruel Prince of the East. Others point out that Wallachia's judicial customs were already severe long before Vlad, meaning the legend may simply have borrowed real imagery and attached his name for branding. You lean toward the second theory because, honestly, history loves a good rebrand. The Ottoman chroniclers wanted a monster. The German printers wanted sales, and the rest of Europe wanted to believe evil wore an exotic accent. It's easier that way. You walk along the outer path, boots crunching gravel, and catch sight of a hawk circling overhead. The air smells sharper now. Ozone, mountain sap, cold. Somewhere, thunder murmurs, but it feels distant, polite. You pause near the edge of a collapsed watchtower, where a section of wall has fallen away to reveal a dark crevice leading straight down into the rock. You toss a pebble inside. It falls for 5 seconds, maybe 6 before you hear the faintest splash. You exhale, realizing how deep the mountain goes. The fortress isn't built on stone. It's carved into it, anchored by its own gravity. And that, you think, is the perfect metaphor for Vlad himself. A man so rooted in fear and purpose that even the earth seemed to hold its breath around him. A gust of wind rises, carrying with it the smell of rain and wood smoke. You can hear faint bells from a monastery somewhere below, their tones oddly serene against the backdrop of cliffs and storm clouds. You remember reading that Vlad once donated land and gold to monasteries across the region, not out of piety but politics. Religion, to him, was just another kind of fortress, invisible but effective. The monks prayed for his soul. He made sure their walls stayed intact. It's a strange kind of symbiosis, like fear shaking hands with faith. You look at the valley again and think how easy it is to confuse protection with possession. You descend part way down the stairs, the same endless spiral that visitors still climb today, and to pause halfway, turning back for one last look. The castle looms above, half shrouded in mist, its edges dissolving into the clouds until it looks like it's floating. For a second, you understand why so many believe the mountain itself hums at night. Maybe it's the wind through tunnels, maybe the settling of stone, or maybe something older, the sound of a place remembering what it was built to contain. You can almost hear chains rattling faintly under the ground, timed perfectly with your heartbeat. It's unsettling and beautiful all at once. You reach the base where the forest begins again, damp moss swallowing sound. The air here is different, green, dense, alive. You stop beside the river, the same Argus that legends say once carried the screams of the boyars rebuilding Poenari. The water looks calm now, but you know it's deceptive. Rivers in this part of the world carry centuries in their current. You crouch beside it, dip your fingers into the icy flow, and feel something like electricity run up your arm. Maybe it's imagination, maybe it's just the cold, but for a moment it feels like the mountain exhaling through the river. The chains beneath, unseen but eternal, still humming with the memory of every command ever shouted above them. You sit on a fallen log and look back up at the fortress. The mist has thinned, and the sky burns a faint orange where the sun fights through clouds. Birds circle lazily around the tower, their cries echoing like distant trumpets. You imagine the people of the 15th century looking up at that same sight, whispering prayers or curses depending on which side they stood. For some, Vlad was the savior who kept foreign invaders at bay. For others, he was the storm himself. Both versions are true, because truth, like these chains, has never existed in a single form. It twists, rusts, tightens, and yet somehow never breaks. You stand, brush the dirt from your hands, and take a deep breath of mountain air that smells of pine and old stories. The fortress glints once in the dying light, a single flash like the reflection of an unsheathed blade. Then the mist rolls back in, swallowing it whole. You start down the path toward the village, feeling the stones shift under your boots, and think about how even legends need anchors. For Vlad, those anchors were literal, iron forged and buried deep beneath his walls, reminders that strength comes with weight. For you, it's the echo of this place, the sound of wind and chain and river all braided together into something that feels like history, breathing through its teeth. You wake to a morning so still it feels staged, the kind of quiet that only happens in places where history is still deciding whether to rest or reload. The valley below Poenari is shrouded in fog, thick enough to erase the line between land and sky, and you stand at the edge of the cliff watching as the sun tries, politely but unsuccessfully, to burn through it. This is the kind of silence Vlad the Impaler loved, not because it was peaceful, but because it was useful. A silent kingdom, after all, is an obedient one. You start walking down the narrow path that snakes along the ridge, boots crunching gravel, and imagine what it must have been like to govern a land this fragile, too rich in ambition to be ignored, too small to defend without theater. You realize with a small shiver of admiration that Vlad's true weapon wasn't the stake or the sword, but the idea that he might use them. Fear was the empire he built, and he ruled it with mathematical precision. The first villagers you pass look up from their fields and nod stiffly, as if acknowledging not you, but the possibility of you. You smile, awkwardly, and keep walking, because in these hills, politeness is a survival instinct, not hospitality. You stop near a well where a group of children are playing a game that involves throwing pebbles at a wooden stick, and one of them hums a tune you can't place. Later, you'll learn it's called The Prince's Shadow, an old folk song supposedly about hiding before nightfall. You realize that centuries after his death, the lessons of Vlad's rule still hum quietly through the culture. Behave, obey, and for the love of God, don't make yourself interesting. There's a mainstream historical fact that anchors this strange serenity. By 1459, during his second reign, Vlad had restored such ruthless order to Wallachia that foreign merchants traveling through his lands reported feeling safer there than anywhere else in Eastern Europe. Roads that had been dangerous for decades were suddenly free of bandits. Thieves disappeared, not metaphorically, just logistically. Crime dropped not because people reformed, but because no one wanted to test the consequences. You could call it early crime prevention, though the modern HR department might have issues with his methods. Vlad understood something that most rulers forgot. The imagination of fear does most of the work for you. You don't have to kill 1,000 men if the rumor says you did. As you continue walking, you pass a wooden cross hammered into the ground, its paint peeled away by centuries of rain. The inscription is half gone, but you catch a few words: Marturi si frica, testimony and fear. You wonder who put it there. Maybe a family whose ancestor once survived one of Vlad's public lessons. There's an old story that when foreign emissaries refused to remove their hats in his presence, a cultural custom of respect, he ordered the hats nailed to their heads so they could keep them on forever. It's the kind of anecdote that sounds like propaganda, except that everyone involved would have absolutely believed him capable of it. You can't help but grin a little. As managerial strategies go, it's excessive, but undeniably memorable. You find yourself on the road to Targovist again, the de facto capital of his rule, though city is a generous term. It was more like an armed rumor surrounded by walls. The gatehouse stands mostly in ruins now, but if you squint through time, you can see the torches burning along its ramparts, soldiers whispering, peasants bowing low as the prince's entourage passes through. Inside, the streets would have been lined with market stalls selling onions, salted fish, and prayers disguised as folk charms. You can almost hear the clatter of hooves echoing off cobblestone, the faint jingle of armor, and the way conversations died mid-sentence whenever Vlad appeared. He had a habit of showing up unannounced, walking among his people in disguise to test their honesty. If someone overcharged him, they vanished. If someone spoke ill of his rule, they vanished faster. And yet, despite all this, the same people called him Vlad Tepes cel Drept, Vlad the Just. You stop at the town square, now just an open field, and sit on a broken stone that might once have been a fountain base. The wind picks up, carrying the smell of dust and rain, and for a moment you can almost see the market day unfolding. Women haggling, merchants shouting, the prince himself standing nearby, watching it all with that unnervingly calm expression. You picture him noticing the golden cup by the fountain, the one he famously placed there so that any traveler could drink from it freely, and you realize the brilliance of it. The cup wasn't just generosity, it was surveillance made visible. The fact that no one dared steal it proved the system worked. Imagine an entire country policed by a single piece of tableware. You chuckle softly because you know modern governments would call it symbolic efficiency. There's a quirky tidbit you remember reading in a dusty museum pamphlet. In one documented instance, a visiting Saxon merchant complained that his goods had been stolen. Vlad personally investigated, found the thief, executed him, and returned double the merchant's losses, then executed the merchant too, for doubting Wallachian justice. It's a small, terrifying parable about trust management. Somewhere, you suspect, he would have made an excellent CEO. You walk beyond the square, following the curve of the Argus River, and notice how everything still feels watched. The forests crowd close to the water, the branches low and clawed, as if listening. You imagine being a villager under his rule, waking each day with both gratitude and dread. The taxes might break your back, but at least your throat was statistically safe. You'd hear stories from neighboring lands, Hungarian raids, Ottoman conscriptions, and you'd whisper thanks that your own prince was too terrifying for outsiders to provoke. You'd rather be ruled by a nightmare you knew than invaded by a dream you didn't trust. That's the genius of fear. It's comforting when it's local. As the day warms, you climb a small hill overlooking the old royal court. You find yourself tracing the remnants of the walls with your eyes, imagining where the council chamber once stood. It's easy to see why he preferred this vantage point. From here, the whole region lies open like a chessboard. You can almost sense him standing beside you, looking at those same lines of fields and rivers, deciding which village needed a warning, which ally needed a visit, which spy needed a public reminder of consequences. His tactics weren't random, they were artfully minimalist. Impalement, contrary to popular imagination, wasn't daily entertainment. It was punctuation. One exclamation mark, well placed, could silence a paragraph of rebellion. Here is where the open scholarly debate still rattles like loose coins in a historian's pocket. Did Vlad invent psychological warfare as deliberate statecraft, or was it simply the natural expression of his paranoia? Some argue that he consciously weaponized rumor, setting up gruesome displays precisely where foreign envoys would pass, ensuring stories would travel faster than armies. Others think he was too volatile for strategy, that the cruelty was just impulse with good timing. The truth, as usual, is probably more complicated and more human. You think about him sitting at his desk, quill scratching across parchment, calculating not just troop movements but emotion itself. Fear as logistics, terror as currency. You step into the ruins of the chapel that once stood beside his court, its stones still blackened from fire. A patch of wildflowers grows where the altar used to be, violets, delicate, and utterly unbothered by history. You kneel for a closer look, brushing dirt from the petals, and can't help but think how absurdly peaceful it feels to be here. This is what time does. It edits. The screams fade, the flowers grow, the tourists arrive. You whisper something to yourself, though you're not sure if it's a prayer or an apology. As you rise, a group of schoolchildren passes by with their teacher, who gestures animatedly toward the ruins, explaining something in Romanian. You catch fragments. Disciplina, onoare, or dean. Discipline, honor, order. The kids nod dutifully, though a few sneak glances at their phones. You smile, because centuries later, he's still teaching lessons, though perhaps not the ones he intended. In a world drowning in noise, the idea of control still seduces. Vlad just had better marketing. You start walking again as thunder rolls distantly over the hills. The sky bruises to a dark greenish gray, and rain begins to patter lightly. You pull your cloak tighter, metaphorical or otherwise, and continue down the dirt road that once connected the royal court to the outer villages. The air smells of ozone and smoke. It's almost cinematic, and you can't help but imagine how he might have used even the weather for intimidation. Picture it, a procession through the rain, banners soaked, hooves splashing mud, and at the center, the prince himself riding in silence, face unreadable, cloak streaming behind him like a shadow that learned to walk upright. You understand now why even his allies avoided eye contact. There's another small fact that rarely gets mentioned in popular retellings, Vlad was deeply religious in his own severe way. He fasted on holy days, funded churches, and reportedly demanded that priests live as strictly as soldiers. But his faith, like everything else about him, was practical. He saw divine order as the scaffolding for political order, God as the ultimate bureaucrat. Some chroniclers even claim he kept a small prayer book by his bedside, though one suspects it was mostly to remind him that even the Almighty appreciated a firm management style. You reach a small ridge where the forest opens up to reveal the plains stretching toward the Danube. Somewhere beyond that river lies the Ottoman Empire, the great, relentless storm always threatening to roll back across the border. You can see why fear was necessary here. Every ruler before and after him faced the same impossible geography. A land small enough to invade, rich enough to covet, and unlucky enough to sit between superpowers. The difference was that Vlad refused to act small. He turned the fear outward, made it visible, theatrical. To his enemies, he became a ghost story in armor. To his people, he was the thin wall between them and annihilation. You sit on a rock, watching the sky darken completely now, the rain falling heavier, and you think about how strange it is that history remembers his violence but forgets his silence. The quiet moments, the calculated pauses, the way he let rumor do his speaking, those were his real masterpieces. He didn't need to shout to terrify the world. He just needed to stop talking long enough for everyone else to imagine what he might be planning. That's bloodless terror, the art of making everyone complicit in their own dread. As you stand to leave, lightning forks across the sky, illuminating the valley in a flash of white. For a split second, the ruins of Poenari blaze to life on the horizon, stark against the storm, and you swear you can see a figure on its walls, cloak whipping in the wind, staring down at the world he built and the legends that outlived him. The thunder follows a few seconds later, low and deliberate, like applause from something ancient. You smile despite yourself. Maybe fear, properly orchestrated, really is a kind of performance art. You start the descent, the path slick now with rain, and the forest swallows you quickly. The night smells of pine and damp soil. Somewhere behind you an owl calls 3 times, always 3, and you laugh softly because even the birds here have good timing. You whisper to the darkness, not out of fear, but respect. I get it. You didn't need blood to rule. You just needed silence that sounded like thunder. By the time you reach the bottom of the valley, the storm has moved on. The air feels clean, the world washed. The moon breaks through the clouds, lighting the river in silver streaks. You look back one last time at the cliffs, now calm and distant, and think about the strange economy of terror, how one man's paranoia became another man's peace. You take a slow breath, the kind that tastes like rain and history, and realize that the scariest thing about Vlad's legacy isn't what he did, it's how much of it worked. The storm doesn't leave. It just takes a break, like a mercenary catching its breath between jobs. By the time you wake, the sky is the color of hammered lead, and the wind off of the Carpathians hums with that eerie prelude to conflict. You stand outside what remains of the southern watchtower, the stones wet, the air sharp, and you can almost taste the anxiety that must have soaked this place centuries ago. It's one thing to build a fortress, it's another to keep it when every direction leads to an enemy pretending to be an ally. You look out across the valley where the mist moves like slow smoke, and in that shifting gray, it's easy to imagine banners. Ottoman, red to the south, Hungarian black and silver to the north, and the faint glint of German mercenary armor somewhere between. Vlad the Impaler stood exactly here, you think, watching the world sharpen its knives, and instead of praying for peace, he tightened his grip on the handle. You start walking the ridge trail toward Targoviste, the capital that still smells faintly of smoke even after 500 years. Every step crunches on gravel, and you wonder how it felt to command from such a vantage point, where mountains were both shield and prison. You remember the saying carved above one of Poenari's doors, Cine se teme de frica, muare de doa ori. He who fears fear dies twice. It's the kind of motto that only makes sense when your enemies surround you on all sides. Down below, somewhere in the labyrinth of valleys, Ottoman scouts were already moving in, their torches flickering like nervous stars. Here's your anchor in the real history. In 1461, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, yes, the same one who took Constantinople, sent envoys to demand tribute from Wallachia. Vlad, ever the diplomat in the way a hawk is diplomatic with a rabbit, refused. He not only withheld payment, but ambushed the Ottoman envoys, sending their bodies back down the river in small, methodical pieces. Historians call it an incident. You call it branding. This was how Vlad's wars began. Not with battles, but with reminders that he didn't play by the Empire's script. As you descend toward the lower forest path, the trees lean close, dripping with rain, their trunks black with moss. Every few steps a crow startles and vanishes into the fog, its wings slicing the silence. You think about how war back then wasn't a matter of nations, but of neighbors. Alliances shifting weekly, armies cobbled together from men who'd been farmers yesterday and corpses tomorrow. The Ottomans had power. Vlad had paranoia, which, as it turns out, is an excellent early warning system. He fortified the mountain passes, drilled his soldiers in ambush tactics, and spread false rumors that he had struck deals with supernatural forces. Fear worked faster than arrows. You stop at the edge of a ravine where a wooden bridge once spanned the gap. Only the stone foundations remain, slick with moss. Somewhere below, water rushes like applause. You imagine Ottoman scouts crossing here under cover of night, torches muffled, their eyes scanning for movement. They wouldn't have made it far. Vlad's forests were alive with watchers, peasants disguised as hunters, shepherds who doubled as spies, even monks carrying coded messages hidden in psalm books. The land itself was his army. The Ottomans called him Gazikli Bey, the Impaler Lord. The locals called him our nightmare who keeps away worse nightmares. Both were right. You climb down toward the riverbank, where mud clings to your boots like guilt, and think about how fragile the balance was. Hungary wanted him to resist the Ottomans, but offered little support. The nobles within his own court plotted constantly, ready to switch his sides at the first whiff of gold. It must have felt like ruling from the middle of a chessboard, where every piece had its own agenda. You picture him pacing his war room, tracing routes across parchment, his fingers stained with ink and candle soot, muttering to himself as he tried to anticipate betrayal before breakfast. Every letter he sent had to be written in 2 languages, one for his allies and one for the spies reading over their shoulders. There's a quirky tidbit from one surviving letter to Matthias Corvinus, the Hungarian king. Vlad described the Ottomans as dogs who howl for gold but sleep in fear. He signed it with the emblem of the Order of the Dragon, as if to remind everyone that his bloodline was forged in holy war. It wasn't just bravado. It was branding again. He understood that rulers win battles twice, first on the field, and then in the story that follows. You glance up at the cliffs where Poenari perches and realize that half his genius was theatrical. His enemies fought his soldiers, but they also fought his reputation, and that's a harder army to defeat. You keep moving, crossing the remains of an old Roman road that now lies broken and overgrown with wildflowers. The petals brush against your boots like whispers. Somewhere nearby, a shepherd's dog barks once, sharp and distant, then nothing. You hear the wind shift and know instinctively that someone once died here, probably many someones. That's what this land does. It absorbs memory until even the grass has opinions. You stop beside a large boulder streaked with iron and rainwater, and in the grain of the rock you think you see shapes, faces almost, if you stare too long. You blink, and they're gone, but the unease remains. War was coming then, as it always does. The Ottomans, insulted by his defiance, prepared an invasion force that would dwarf anything Wallachia could muster. The chronicles claim 150,000 men marched north, though numbers in medieval accounts are always exaggerated. Fear has a habit of rounding up. Vlad's army, by comparison, might have numbered 20,000 at best. But numbers aren't everything when your home terrain is a weapon. He burned villages ahead of the advancing Turks, poisoned wells, and relocated populations into the mountains. He turned his own country into a trap so complete that even survival looked like treachery. The chronicles call it scorched earth. You call it risk management with flair. By the time the Ottoman vanguard reached Targovaid, they found a ghost kingdom. Fields burned, towns empty, animals gone. And then came the forests. You've heard the story before, the infamous Forest of the Impaled. But standing here, you feel its reality in your bones. Rows upon rows of wooden stakes stretching for miles, each crowned with a corpse, the air thick with the stench of death and smoke. Whether the number was hundreds or thousands, it doesn't matter. The sight itself broke the invaders before the battle even began. Even the Sultan, hardened by years of conquest, reportedly turned pale and ordered a retreat from that cursed field. Historians still argue whether he actually saw it or whether it's just another myth amplified by terrified witnesses. But in Wallachia, myth was the point. You don't need to fight an army if you can haunt it. You stand now at the site where that grim spectacle is said to have stood. The soil here feels heavier somehow, as if memory itself has weight. The grass grows thick and uneven, and the air tastes faintly metallic, like a sword left too long in the rain. You take a deep breath and imagine the silence that followed. The Ottoman army retreating, the crows gathering, the smoke curling upward like a warning letter addressed to the heavens. It's grotesque, yes, but also strategic genius. In one move, he turned terror into diplomacy. You can almost hear him whisper, "Let them tell the story for me." Here's your open, scholarly debate. Did Vlad actually orchestrate this horror as a psychological defense, or was it exaggerated propaganda later used by his enemies to vilify him? Some scholars insist it was staged, designed to terrify the Sultan into withdrawing. Others argue it was never that large, just inflated by rumor and German printers who knew that nothing sold better than scandal from the East. You smile grimly, thinking about how little has changed. Fear still clicks faster than truth. You start back toward the mountains, the path steep and slippery with moss. The sky breaks open again, releasing a fine mist that clings to your eyelashes. The air smells of wet pine and old smoke. You picture Vlad riding through this same weather centuries ago, armor slick with rain, cloak heavy, eyes scanning the horizon for movement. He wasn't just defending land, he was defending the idea of Wallachia itself, a fragile identity wedged between empires that preferred it erased. Maybe that's why his cruelty feels so complicated. It wasn't mindless, it was mathematical. Every corpse was a calculation. How much fear does it take to buy one more day of independence? At the ridge, you stop to rest beside an old watchfire pit, now filled with weeds. You pick up a charred stick and twirl it between your fingers, thinking of the soldiers who once warmed their hands here, whispering about the ghosts said to follow their prince. Some said he never slept, others that he spoke to the wind for advice. One even claimed he could sense betrayal in his dreams. Whether true or not, those stories kept the troops loyal. It's easier to obey a legend than a man. You stare into the emptiness where their camp once stood and feel the faint vibration of thunder rolling far off, a sound like memory clearing its throat. You begin the last stretch back to Poenari as night falls. The fortress glows faintly on the peak, a dim lantern in a sea of fog. The wind has turned colder, sharper, and every gust seems to whisper something you can't quite catch. Maybe it's your imagination, or maybe it's the mountain reminding you that Vlad's story isn't done yet. You remember how he once described his enemies as ants gnawing at the roots of the oak. You think about that while climbing, the way fear and strength are both just reactions to pressure. He didn't hate his enemies, he needed them. Without opposition, his legend wouldn't have muscle. By the time you reach the top, the world has gone completely dark. The torches along the path flicker weakly in their metal brackets. You stand at the fortress gate, breathing hard, rainwater dripping from your hair, and you swear you can feel the mountain humming under your feet. Maybe it's thunder. Maybe it's the chains again. You look up at the walls, silhouetted against lightning, and understand that this place was never meant to be a home. It was meant to be a warning carved into the clouds. You step inside, into the courtyard, where puddles shimmer like small mirrors, and the air smells of stone and smoke. You walk slowly to the center and turn in a circle, taking in the walls, the towers, the empty windows. You imagine Vlad here, standing in the same spot after the Ottomans retreated, rain falling, armor dented, boots sunk in mud, looking not triumphant, but tired. He had won, yes, but victory always demanded too much of the living. You can almost hear him mutter, "They'll be back," because they always were. Empires don't forgive. They regroup. You tilt your head and listen, the rain steady, the wind low, the mountain alive. You realize that Vlad's story was never really about cruelty or salvation. It was about endurance. Every chain beneath these walls, every rumor, every scar left on the land was his way of saying, "We are still here." You take one last look over the parapet toward the black valley below and see nothing but fog, endless and soft. Yet somewhere out there, the world still remembers. The enemies are always at the gates, but the gates, somehow, are still standing. You wake to the smell of smoke before you see the flames, that particular kind of scent that doesn't belong to campfires or kitchens. It's the smell of preparation, of men turning forests into strategy. The mist over Wallachia's plains glows faintly red, and the wind carries the restless murmur of thousands of soldiers whispering prayers that are half hope, half apology. It's the summer of 1462. and you can feel history pacing just outside the firelight. The Ottomans are coming again, larger this time, heavier, more certain, their banners already blotting the horizon. You stand among Vlad's troops, the mud sucking at your boots, the river steaming beside you, and realize the prince isn't at his throne tonight. He's already mounted, his black horse restless beneath him, eyes glinting in the torchlight. This is the moment every chronicler later tried to embellish. The night Vlad turned fear itself into a marching order. The numbers alone were absurd. Mehmed II had brought somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 soldiers, maybe more depending on whose propaganda you trust. Vlad had barely 20,000, maybe less after weeks of skirmishes. To fight directly would have been suicide, so he decided not to fight directly. You imagine him at his command tent, bent over maps that look like veins of light across darkness, marking not battlefields but nightmares. He doesn't want victory. He wants confusion. He doesn't want blood. He wants panic. You can see the plan forming behind his eyes, the famous Noapte de Groadze, the Night of Terror, which later generations would call the night attack at Targovist. The camp prepares in silence. Soldiers smear their faces with soot, wrap a cloth around their armor to muffle the clink of metal, and tie strips of wet leather around their boots. The horses are restless, sensing something uncanny in their master's calm. Vlad moves through the ranks like a shadow, stopping occasionally to whisper something you can't hear. He doesn't shout orders, he breathes them. Each small group of men knows its path, its target, its signal. The entire plan depends on precision, on timing, and on terror itself. In the distance, across the river, you can see the Ottoman torches, thousands of them, flickering like a field of molten gold. You imagine the soldiers over there laughing, unaware that they're being watched by eyes that don't blink. Here's the historical backbone. On the night of June 17th, 1462, Vlad the Impaler led a surprise night attack on the massive Ottoman encampment near Targovist, aiming not to destroy the army, but to assassinate Sultan Mehmed II himself. It's one of those events where history feels like cinema. Fire, smoke, confusion, and a prince moving like a ghost through enemy lines. Contemporary sources, both Ottoman and Western, describe the raid with awe and horror. Some said he reached the Sultan's tent, others that he missed by minutes. Either way, the attack threw the entire Ottoman army into chaos, and that was enough. You walk beside the army as they move out, torches extinguished, the forest swallowing sound. Even the frogs along the river seem to hold their breath. The air smells of pine, leather, and adrenaline. The moon hides behind clouds, a co-conspirator. Every step forward feels like stepping deeper into a dream that doesn't want to end well. You can almost hear Vlad whispering instructions as they reach the Ottoman perimeter. Light nothing, speak not, strike where you see breath. The men nod, faces expressionless. You think of them not as soldiers, but as shadows with pulse and purpose. And then it begins, a signal, 3 hawk cries, too perfect to be real. And suddenly the darkness erupts. Arrows whistle, torches blaze, horses scream. The Wallachian cavalry charges through the sleeping camp, cutting tents, setting fires, stabbing blindly at silhouettes. The confusion is instant and complete. You picture Ottoman soldiers stumbling from their beds, grabbing swords and shields, finding not battle lines but nightmares running loose. Vlad rides at the front, his cloak snapping behind him, his face streaked with soot, his voice sharp as iron. He doesn't rally with speeches. He directs like a conductor. One hand gesture, one glance, and an entire flank shifts. The attack is so fast, so precise, it doesn't even feel like a battle. It feels like a choreography performed on the edge of hell. A chronicler named Chalcocon Diles later wrote that the Ottomans fought the night itself, and you can see why. The fires spread in uneven spirals, lighting up banners and faces, turning the camp into a living painting of chaos. You smell burning oil, wet canvas, the acrid tang of powder and sweat. You can hear shouts in Turkish, Greek, Romanian, all blending into one terrified language. Somewhere near the center, a massive pavilion catches fire, the golden crescent embroidered on its side curling in the heat. For a moment, you think Vlad has done it, that Mehmed's tent is burning. But then you see another, larger one beyond, still intact, and you realize how close history came to changing course. There's a quirky detail buried in an Ottoman source that you can't help but love. It claims that during the raid, Vlad shouted orders in Turkish, mimicking the voices of Ottoman officers to deepen the confusion. Whether true or not, it's the kind of theatrical genius that fits him perfectly. He didn't just fight, he performed war like a symphony. And, like any good composer, he knew when to stop. After several hours, with dawn still a rumor on the horizon, he signaled the retreat. His men vanished into the forest, leaving behind smoldering tents, broken supply lines, and a rumor that would outlive them all, that a demon prince had attacked the Sultan's camp and escaped untouched. You walk the battlefield at dawn. The mist is thicker now, the air full of the sour scent of burned cloth and extinguished fire. Crows gather in polite clusters, picking at what's left of last night's ambition. You imagine the Sultan, standing there, surveying the wreckage, realizing how close he came to death. He orders prayers for the fallen and fortifications for the living, but somewhere behind his calm, you know fear has found a new address. That was Vlad's goal. Not victory, but infestation. Once fear lives inside your enemy, it pays rent forever. As you move through what's left of the camp, you find small fragments, a scorched belt buckle, a piece of torn silk, a broken arrow lodged in the dirt. History is generous with souvenirs if you know where to look. You crouch beside the arrow and trace its fletching, thinking about how one man's desperation becomes another century's legend. A voice inside you, maybe imagination, maybe history itself, murmurs that this night changed everything. For the Ottomans, it was a wound to pride. For Vlad, it was proof that terror could substitute for numbers. For the rest of us, it's a reminder that brilliance and brutality often share the same handwriting. The road to Bran is deceptively calm, a curling ribbon of cobblestone and pine roots that climbs higher and higher into the Carpathians until the air itself feels thinner, almost hesitant, like it's trying not to wake something sleeping inside the stone. You walk it slowly, boots brushing frost from the ground. The morning mist so dense it moves more like a liquid than air. The first glimpse of the castle comes suddenly, not as a shape, but as a presence. Gray towers piercing through the fog, walls pressed tight against a cliff as if it's hiding from the sky. The locals still call it Castello Louis Dracula, though historians will happily argue that Vlad may never have lived here. But that's the problem with myths. They move in faster than facts can pack their bags. And besides, the stones don't seem to mind what name you give them. They already know who they belong to. The gates creak as you push them open, and the smell of wet earth and old wood greets you like a slow exhale. The courtyard is narrow, almost claustrophobic, its stones slick with rain and age. You can hear the wind sigh through arrow slits, and somewhere inside, water drips rhythmically, as though the building keeps its own pulse. You think of Vlad walking through a place like this, if not Bran itself, then one of its cousins, his boots echoing off walls too thick for conversation, his breath fogging the air while advisors trailed behind him in nervous silence. He would have liked this kind of structure, compact, defensive, obsessed with control. Bran is less a home than a declaration written in stone. Come closer if you dare. A guide appears from the shadows, a woman in a heavy coat with a lantern that makes her face glow amber, and gestures for you to follow. There are tunnels, she says softly, as though afraid of waking them. You nod and step inside, descending a narrow staircase that spirals like a snake. The air cools instantly, your breath rising in thin clouds. The walls close in, rough to the touch, scraped by centuries of hands and maybe something else. Down here, light doesn't travel far. It clings to surfaces like it's afraid to be alone. Here's your historical fact anchor. Bran Castle was built in the late 14th century, strategically positioned to guard a key trade route between Transylvania and Wallachia. By the time of Vlad's reign, it was under the control of the Hungarian crown. But correspondence between Vlad and local commanders suggests he used the region's network of fortresses, including Bran, for temporary refuge and interrogation. There are records of prisoners being held in underground rooms during that time, though whether Vlad himself ever ordered it is another matter entirely. Still, the myth fits too neatly to ignore. You can almost hear the chains, even if they're only memory pretending to be metal. You follow the guide into a tunnel that seems too deliberate to be natural. The lower levels were used for storage, she whispers, and sometimes for other purposes. Her voice trails off like a candle guttering. You nod because some details don't need confirmation. The floor slopes downward, the stones slick with condensation. You pass alcoves filled with tools, rusted hooks, iron rings, a bucket that's turned the color of dried blood. Whether these were for livestock or something less innocent, you can't tell. The air smells of mineral dust and secrets, and you start to understand why people insist the castle remembers things. There's a niche in the wall ahead, sealed off by iron bars, and inside it you glimpse faint carvings. A dragon curling around a sword, a sun above a crescent moon. Symbols of the Order of the Dragon, perhaps, or maybe just the imagination of bored masons. The guide leans closer and says, "Some say this was where he questioned his spies." You raise an eyebrow. Questioned? She smiles slightly, the kind of smile that means she's repeated the word because the truth doesn't fit in polite sentences. You stare into that small, barred space and think about how leadership in the 15th century often came down to patience and proximity. You didn't have to hurt people yourself if the walls could do it for you. A quirky tidbit from local folklore says that Bran's underground tunnels were once connected to the mountain caves beyond the castle. Secret routes for messengers, or, depending on who's telling the story, Vlad's personal escape passages. Archaeologists haven't found definitive proof, but they've found enough collapsed sections to make the theory hard to dismiss. You can almost picture him moving through them by torchlight, his footsteps measured, his mind already 3 moves ahead. It's easy to forget that paranoia and strategy often share the same handwriting. You climb down another level, where the air feels heavier, thicker. The lantern flickers as the guide pauses before a wooden door reinforced with black iron bands. She opens it slowly, and the hinges shriek like something protesting resurrection. Inside lies a small chamber, low ceiling, stone bench, one narrow window where a line of gray light leaks in. The walls bear faint scratches, too uniform to be random. You trace them with your fingers and realize they form tally marks, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. You stop counting when your throat tightens. The guide doesn't speak. She doesn't need to. This is where your open scholarly debate enters like a chill through a crack. Historians disagree on whether Bran's dungeons were ever used during Vlad's campaigns or whether they're later fabrications meant to feed the tourist appetite for horror. Some point to Ottoman records that describe captured soldiers being held in stone rooms without sun along the Transylvanian border. Others argue the descriptions fit countless fortresses across the region, not specifically Bran. The truth, as usual, hides between precision and myth, smirking at anyone who tries to separate them. But as you stand there, the debate feels irrelevant. The air is too heavy with memory for facts to matter. You leave the chamber quietly and follow the tunnel deeper. The ground tilts upward now, leading to a smaller hall lined with niches. The guide explains that one of these openings once led to a secret stairway, collapsed centuries ago, that supposedly connected directly to the forest outside. She says this in the tone of someone half convinced the stairway still exists, just clever enough to hide. You glance down into the dark and feel an almost magnetic pull, the irrational urge to climb into it, to see where it goes. The guide notices your hesitation and smiles. "It's always the same," she says. "Everyone thinks they hear something down there." You listen, and she's right. A faint metallic hum, rhythmic and patient, like chains swaying in some deep chamber where light has never been. You emerge from the tunnels into the main hall, where sunlight slants through narrow windows, turning the dust into golden fog. The sudden warmth feels almost intrusive after the chill below. You look around at the thick beams overhead, the faded tapestries, the grand fireplace where centuries of smoke have darkened the stone. The guide leaves you here. "You can find your way back," she says, though it sounds more like a dare, and you wander alone through the corridors. You stop at a window overlooking the valley. The view is heartbreakingly serene. Green slopes rolling down toward villages that look like toys. The horizon framed by peaks so blue they could be painted. You think of how strange it is that a place built for war could age into something this peaceful. But maybe that's the trick of time. It turns fortresses into museums, cruelty into curiosity, and nightmares into souvenirs. You watch clouds drift across the peaks and wonder if Vlad ever looked out from a window like this, realizing that peace, like beauty, was something his world couldn't afford. Another mainstream historical note fits neatly here. Though Bran became part of Dracula's legend through Stoker's imagination, its association with Vlad persisted long before fiction. Local chronicles mention his presence in the area during campaigns against Saxon merchants who defied his trade laws. It's plausible he passed through Bran, if only to inspect its defenses or to remind the local lords who truly ruled the mountains. Those Saxon merchants later published pamphlets portraying him as a bloodthirsty tyrant, a primitive form of media war. You smile at the irony. The birthplace of modern public relations might well have been these hills, written in ink and fear. You walk further into the hall, where a set of portraits hangs crooked on the wall. One shows a man with sharp features and dark eyes labeled Vlad Three Tepes. The expression is neither cruel nor kind, just alert, like someone deciding whether you're worth the truth. You study it for a long moment, wondering if he'd recognize the legend he's become. Probably not. Legends rarely ask permission from their protagonists. The corridor narrows again, leading to a small room filled with artifacts, armor, coins, a few handwritten letters behind glass. One of them bears his seal, a dragon entwined with a cross. The handwriting is precise, elegant, and painfully controlled. The translation reads, "I would rather reign among wolves than kneel among men." You whisper the words out loud, and they echo softly in the empty room, like a truth that's been waiting centuries to be believed. You turn to leave, but something catches your attention. A small wooden door tucked behind a tapestry, slightly ajar. You push it open. A narrow stair descends into darkness. No sign, no rope, no "do not enter." Just black stone steps fading into shadow. Against all better judgment, you step inside. The air is cold, sharp, and metallic again. You descend slowly, hand brushing the wall. The sound returns, the same faint clink of iron, steady, distant, impossible. You reach the bottom to find a small, circular room barely larger than a closet. In its center, a single iron ring is embedded in the floor, surrounded by scorch marks. Nothing else. You crouch, touch the ring, and it's warm. That shouldn't be possible. You straighten slowly, pulse quickening. There's no one here, but the air feels occupied, as if the room itself is thinking. You whisper, "All right, I believe you." And for a moment, the air softens, as though satisfied. You climb back up, heart steadying, and step into the daylight again. The castle looks different now, less imposing, almost sympathetic. You walk out into the courtyard, where the wind carries the faint scent of pine and rain. The mountains around Bran are still, the sky a pale wash of silver. You glance back once at the towers, their tops lost in cloud, and realize the secret isn't what lies beneath the castle, but what the legend itself conceals. That fear, in the right hands, becomes architecture. It can shape land, history, even memory. As you walk down the winding road toward the village, the sun breaks through the mist for the first time all day. The light hits the castle's upper windows, and, for an instant, it shines like gold. Then it fades again, slipping back into gray. You smile because it feels right. This balance between revelation and retreat, between myth and fact. Some stories, you realize, are meant to remain half in shadow. The chains beneath Bran Castle are probably just iron and rust. But the echo they make, that's something else entirely. It's the sound of history, remembering that it was never supposed to sleep quietly. The morning you enter Brasov, the mist feels different. Thinner but sharper, like the air itself has been honed for negotiation. The market square below the fortress walls is already alive with movement. Merchants shouting in German, traders from Wallachia haggling in broken Latin, a few Hungarian soldiers leaning against the well pretending not to listen. You stand in the middle of it, hands in your coat pockets, trying to imagine this place as it was when Vlad the Impaler arrived. Not with an army, but with silence. You realize, as you watch the crowd ripple around you, that he didn't need swords to command attention. His presence alone was a diplomatic document written in muscle and myth. People always say diplomacy is the art of compromise, but in his hands it was the art of controlled fear. You walk up toward the city's old council hall, its tower jutting through the low clouds. The bells ring noon, hollow and precise, and the sound seems to echo forever in the valley. The square smells of bread and smoke and horses, and you can almost picture the scene from 1460, when Vlad's envoys came to demand taxes owed by the Saxon merchants of Brasov. They refused, of course. Nobody likes paying tribute, especially not to a man with his nickname. What followed is the kind of episode that makes historians sigh and storytellers grin. Vlad's soldiers raided the outskirts, captured the merchants, and, if the German chronicles are to be believed, impaled them outside the city walls in neat, symmetrical rows. Whether or not it happened exactly that way is up for debate, but the message was clear. Pay your debts or become a monument. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Vlad's conflict with the Transylvanian Saxons around 1459-1460 is well documented. Contemporary letters confirm trade disputes, raids, and retaliatory executions. The scale, though, is murky. Saxon sources inflated numbers to demonize him, while Romanian chroniclers later deflated them to defend him. What's undeniable is that he understood the psychology of spectacle. He didn't just punish rebellion, he choreographed it. You imagine him riding into Brasov afterward, the crowd parting, no army behind him, just the echo of reputation walking in first. That was his true weapon. Anticipation. The old city walls still stand, cracked and covered in moss, and you trail your fingers along them as you walk. The stones are rough, cold, faintly damp from morning drizzle. You stop beneath a weathered archway and look up at the mural of a saint, glaring down, sword raised, eyes wide. The locals say that was added after Vlad's campaign as protection against further visits. You smirk. Superstition and policy have always made excellent neighbors. You pass a tavern where a group of old men play cards and drink plum brandy. One of them looks up and says in Romanian, "He was a good ruler, hard but fair." The others nod as if reciting a prayer. You raise your glass and salute, even though you know that hard but fair is history's favorite euphemism for terrifyingly competent. As the sun climbs higher, the market grows louder. Hoofbeats, laughter, coins clinking. You wander through the stalls, past barrels of apples, bolts of linen, candles shaped like saints. Somewhere a musician plays a mournful tune on a pipe, and the melody drifts above the noise like a bird circling a battlefield. You think about how Vlad must have felt when he first came here as a ruler, negotiating with people who considered him barbaric. He could speak their language, literally, but not their politics. To them, he was the Wild East wrapped in a cape, a provincial prince with too much intensity and not enough manners. But intensity was his point. You imagine him sitting at a long table with Saxon envoys, fingers steepled, voice calm, eyes never blinking. The kind of man who could make small talk sound like a threat. There's a quirky tidbit in one of the lesser-known chronicles that claims Vlad once offered a feast to the Saxon council members after their surrender. Lavish food, barrels of wine, musicians playing, and halfway through the meal he had the servants lock the doors. Then he raised his cup and said, "Tonight, no one leaves until we understand each other." By morning, the hall was empty except for silence and spilled wine. Whether that's fact or fable doesn't matter much. The story tells you everything about his negotiation style. Dread as etiquette, politeness as camouflage. You head uphill toward the fortress ruins above Brasov, the path winding through pine forests where the air smells of sap and rain. The climb is steep, the ground slick with fallen needles, and every gust of wind sounds like a whisper repeating your steps. At the top, the city spreads out below you like a chessboard of red roofs and gray stone. You sit on a fallen wall, catching your breath, and try to picture the banners that once hung here, Hungarian, Saxon, Wallachian, all fluttering in uneasy alliance. This was the heart of a region that thrived on trade and betrayal in equal measure. You realize that Vlad's diplomacy wasn't built on trust, but on mathematics. How much fear buys one treaty, how many threats equal 1 year of peace. You can still see his logic everywhere. Below the fortress, the roads crisscross like veins, leading to villages that once paid tribute in both coin and loyalty. Merchants traded goods but also gossip, carrying his legend north into German lands, where printing presses turned him into Europe's first tabloid villain. The pamphlets described him feasting among impaled bodies, drinking blood from goblets, laughing as his victims screamed. The images were lurid, exaggerated, but effective. He became a global brand before globalism existed. You can almost admire the efficiency. He didn't have social media. He had terrified monks with quills. And yet, even as his reputation blackened abroad, it brightened at home. Wallachians saw him as the one ruler who refused to bow, who made foreign envoys tremble instead of gloat. His cruelty was their currency of safety. You think of modern politics. How fear and respect so often trade places like actors sharing a costume. Vlad just happened to wear both better than anyone. You look down at Brasov again, at the tidy streets and quiet towers, and realize that civilization owes much of its calm to men who once refused to be civilized. You step into a small chapel halfway down the slope, its wooden door creaking like an old sigh. Inside, the air smells of wax and dust. Candles flicker against painted icons. Christ, the Virgin, the saints, faces serene, eyes heavy with compassion. You kneel, not to pray, but to listen. The wind outside hums softly through cracks in the wood, and for a moment you imagine Vlad kneeling here too, whispering his own strange prayers. He believed in God, yes, but as a partner in power, not a comforter. There's a line from one of his surviving letters to a monastery. God gave me this burden of rule. I repay him with vigilance. You repeat it under your breath, and feel how heavy that word vigilance becomes when translated through centuries of exhaustion. You leave the chapel and follow the trail back toward the city. The bells ring again, echoing down the valley. It's a clean, metallic sound. Discipline in auditory form. You imagine him hearing it after a successful negotiation. Standing at the edge of town, cloak pulled tight against the wind, thinking not of triumph, but of timing. Because for all his ferocity, he was painfully aware that fear, like fire, dies without fuel. The hardest part of ruling through dread wasn't igniting it, it was maintaining it at the right temperature. Too little, and people grew bold. Too much, and they stopped functioning. He balanced it with the precision of a clockmaker, adjusting gears you couldn't see. Here's where the open, scholarly debate returns, as persistent as the wind itself. Was Vlad's diplomacy a mask for insecurity, or a genuine system of governance designed for survival? Some historians argue he overcompensated for Wallachia's weakness by projecting invincibility, a kind of medieval bluff. Others say he simply understood psychology better than his contemporaries, that terror, used sparingly and predictably, could stabilize a kingdom faster than faith or law. The truth probably lies in the uneasy marriage between both ideas. Bluff and brilliance, necessity and ego. They all share the same heartbeat. You wander into the city square again just as evening falls. The sky turns bruised purple, lanterns flicker on, and the air fills with the smell of roasted meat and smoke. You sit by the fountain where musicians tune their instruments, and you notice how life has continued seamlessly on top of fear's ashes. Children chase each other around the statues. Merchants argue over coin. Couples share wine beneath the archways. If history leaves any message here, it's that dread, once spent, makes room for comfort. The city Vlad once punished for rebellion now profits from his legend. You take a sip of hot wine and think not unkindly that even tyrants become tourism eventually. But then something shifts. The wind rises, carrying a low hum from the mountains beyond, one of those sounds that's half nature, half memory. You turn toward it, heart tightening slightly, because it doesn't sound random. It sounds deliberate. The same rhythm you've been hearing in every place you visit, from Poenari's tunnels to Bran's hidden rooms. The soft, steady echo of chains. It's there again now, faint beneath the laughter, the music, the market chatter. You close your eyes and realize it's not metal at all. It's the echo of influence, the sound power makes when it refuses to vanish. You stand, stretch, and look once more at Brasov's skyline, glowing under the last light of dusk. The castle above catches the sunset, its towers gleaming like candle flames. You imagine Vlad somewhere beyond that horizon, riding alone through pine forests, his mind a careful ledger of debts and allegiances. You wonder if he ever wanted peace or if peace just sounded like boredom to him. Either way, his version of diplomacy endures. Not handshakes or treaties, but the silent agreement everyone makes when fear becomes more convenient than freedom. The bells ring one last time. The crowd stills for a heartbeat, listening. And in that single shared pause, you understand his genius completely. He didn't need to speak to command. He just needed people to stop talking long enough to remember why they should listen. The square exhales, noise returns, and life goes on. You take a deep breath of cold mountain air and start walking toward the road out of town. Behind you, the faint clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoes through the night. Steady, rhythmic, patient. Not unlike diplomacy itself, still shaping the world one calculated strike at a time. Dot. By the time you reach Buda, the Danube looks nothing like the rivers of Wallachia. It's too wide, too calm, too confident in its own importance. The city rises on both sides like a crown of stone, palaces gleaming under the thin winter sun, bridges thick with the sound of wagons and conversation. You stand on the banks and realize that this is where Vlad's story bends sharply. Away from command, away from fire, and into the quiet humiliation of being a prisoner who still believes he's a ruler. The year is 1462, and the prince who once terrified an empire now sits behind iron bars, a guest of King Matthias Corvinus. The irony is almost beautiful in its cruelty. A dragon kept in a gilded cage, surrounded by diplomacy instead of chains. The air in Buda feels heavy, perfumed with trade and treachery. You make your way up the hill toward the royal palace, boots clicking against marble steps polished by centuries of ambition. Inside, the walls glow with gold and frescoes. Courtiers whisper in Latin and Hungarian, each phrase dripping with courtesy and calculation. You can almost hear Vlad among them, his accent sharp, his patience thinner by the day. He'd come here seeking alliance against the Ottomans, bearing letters and promises. Instead, Matthias arrested him on charges of treason, using forged documents that painted him as a conspirator with the Turks. Whether the king believed them, or merely found them convenient, hardly matters. The message was clear. A ruler who trades in fear eventually becomes too frightening to trust. You wander through what's left of the old palace complex, now half museum, half ghost. A plaque near one corner quietly claims, "Site of Vlad III's imprisonment, 1462-1475. You pause, imagining that narrow cell, stone walls sweating with cold, a slit window framing only gray sky. You can almost smell it: damp wool, candle smoke, the faint metallic sting of regret. Yet even here he refused to vanish. There are accounts, half rumor, half admiration, of Vlad befriending his guards, sharing stories, even earning their respect. One German chronicler noted, he was feared still, even unarmed. That's the kind of power you don't lose. It just changes temperature. The mainstream historical fact is simple. Vlad was indeed held captive in Hungary for roughly a dozen years, though not in continuous confinement. After the first harsh months, he was transferred to more comfortable quarters, even accompanying Matthias to court functions. Some sources claim he was treated as a political guest rather than a prisoner, a euphemism only history could deliver with a straight face. Still, imagine the dissonance. Once the scourge of empires, now forced to bow politely to them. You picture him sitting at a banquet beside noblewomen in silk, smiling through gritted teeth while a minstrel sings a sanitized ballad about his past. There's a quirky tidbit buried in Hungarian folklore that says Vlad kept a sparrow in his cell, feeding it crumbs of bread and training it to land on his shoulder when he spoke. Some claim he taught it to mimic his whistle, using it to startle guards who thought they heard ghosts. Whether true or not, it's exactly the kind of theatrical defiance you'd expect from a man who once used entire forests as stage props. Even caged, he understood a performance. He'd learned long ago that power was 30% action and 70% rumor. You step through an arched doorway into a small stone courtyard, enclosed on all sides. The echo of your footsteps bounces off the walls in perfect rhythm, like the heartbeat of the building. You imagine Vlad pacing here at dusk, counting the stones, muttering calculations to himself. Who's loyal? Who's alive? How long until opportunity visits again? He wasn't the kind to waste confinement. In his mind, every cell was a strategy room waiting to be unlocked. The scholarly debate about his imprisonment never quite settles. Some argue Matthias needed him alive, as a symbol of strength against the Ottomans and as a deterrent to other ambitious princes. Others think the king simply didn't know what to do with him. Killing Vlad might have turned him into a martyr. Releasing him too soon would have unleashed chaos. So Matthias did what all clever rulers do when faced with impossible choices. He delayed. History, after all, rewards those who wait for their enemies to die of irrelevance. But Vlad was not built for irrelevance. You leave the palace grounds and walk toward the lower town, where narrow streets twist between tall stone houses. The scent of roasting meat and honeyed wine fills the air. It's market day, and the chatter sounds timeless. Merchants shouting prices, children laughing, horses snorting. You pause beside a fountain carved with lions and watch a group of monks pass by, their robes fluttering like tired wings. You wonder if they prayed for him back then or against him. Probably both. Even the clergy couldn't quite decide whether he was a divine punishment or divine protection. You stop at a small tavern tucked into the corner of a cobblestone street. Inside, the light is low, the air thick with smoke and warmth. You order mulled wine and sit near the fire, letting the heat thaw your hands. On the wall above you hangs an old woodcut, faded but unmistakable, depicting Vlad impaling enemies beneath a crescent moon. The caption, in Gothic script, reads, Der Faller, König der Angst, the Impaler, King of Fear. You trace the lines with your eyes and think about how reputation travels faster than truth. Even in captivity, the legend marched on without him. crossing borders, languages, and eventually centuries. Somewhere in that gap between man and myth, he must have realized he'd already won the only war that mattered, the war for remembrance. A local historian sitting nearby overhears you studying the image and says, "You know, he wasn't chained forever." You turn, curious. The man continues. Matthias released him in the 1470s. He even gave him soldiers to help reclaim his throne. You can imprison a man, but not his usefulness. You nod. History loves recycling, and Vlad, apparently, was too valuable a monster to keep in storage forever. You finish your wine and step back into the street, the night colder now, stars sharp above the river. The castle glows faintly on the hill, pale against the dark. You imagine him looking out that same window long ago. The Danube frozen over, lights from distant houses shimmering like small promises. Maybe he wondered what Wallachia looked like under snow. Maybe he smiled, thinking that fear, unlike kingdoms, doesn't melt. A gust of wind knocks your hood back, and you close your eyes, hearing the phantom rhythm of horses again. In your mind, you replay the final moments. Vlad, charging forward through mud and snow, sword high, shouting words that no one can quite make out. The Ottomans press in, the air thick with steam and blood, and somewhere amid the chaos, he vanishes. No body recovered, no witness reliable, just a rumor that he fought until his sword broke and then kept fighting with the hilt. It's a kind of story that sounds impossible, which is exactly why it endured. The scholarly debate about his death is endless, looping like a song with no chorus. Some historians insist his head was taken to Constantinople, was presented to Sultan Mehmed II in a jar of honey as proof of victory. Others argue that his loyal followers secretly buried him near the island monastery of Snagov, disguising the grave so thoroughly that even time itself can't find it. In 1930, archaeologists actually excavated a tomb at Snagov Monastery, hoping to solve the mystery. It was empty. Or worse, it contained the bones of animals instead of men. You can almost hear Vlad's laughter at that. Even in death, he managed to stage-manage confusion. You start walking toward the forest edge, where the snow is deeper, the silence thicker. Each step sinks with a soft crunch that feels ceremonial. You imagine the retreating soldiers after the battle, tattered, numb, dragging what was left of him through the trees, desperate to hide his body before the Ottomans found it. Maybe they succeeded, maybe they didn't. But somewhere beneath this same frozen ground, you sense something unresolved, an absence that still radiates authority. You reach the tree line and pause. The forest feels different here, denser, older, like it's been waiting centuries to finish a conversation. The trunks rise like pillars, and the branches knit together overhead, blocking most of the light. You step inside, and the air instantly cools. The world outside fades away until there's only the sound of your own breathing and the faint creak of snow-laden branches. The ground dips slightly, forming a natural hollow, and at its center stands a single stone cross tilted at an angle, carved with the faint shape of a dragon. No marker, no name, just the symbol of the order that defined him. You kneel beside it, brush away the snow, and whisper, "Is this where you stopped?" The wind answers softly, almost kindly. Here's the mainstream detail most tourists miss. Even in the centuries after his death, Wallachian rulers maintained the custom of invoking his name before battle. Priests would bless troops with prayers that included the line, May the spirit of the impaler guard the border. It wasn't affection. It was insurance. Fear has a longer shelf life than loyalty. You think about that as you sit in the quiet forest, surrounded by trees that have seen every season since his bones vanished. It's strange how the man who terrified empires now exists mostly as a charm against them. You pull your cloak tighter and stand, brushing off snow. The forest hums faintly, not with voices, but with tension, the kind that exists when a story refuses to end. You start back toward the plain, your footprints already filling behind you. The sun dips low, the clouds glowing faint orange at the edges. You imagine the battlefield as it must have looked after, the snow churned to mud, shields abandoned, birds circling overhead, and somewhere a single horse still wandering, its saddle empty. There's a final fragment from a German pamphlet printed decades after his death. It describes a merchant crossing Wallachia who claimed to have seen a lone knight riding near Targowiesen, cloaked in black, his face half hidden, his banner torn but still marked with the dragon. The merchant swore the rider saluted him before vanishing into fog. The locals shrugged and said, "That's just the prince checking his borders." You smile. It sounds absurd, but then again, what part of his life didn't? You walk along the frozen river bank, where the last of the daylight bleeds into the water. The surface reflects the clouds like molten glass, cracked by ripples of current. You can't help wondering what he thought in his final moments, whether he regretted the fear he'd built or took pride in its efficiency. He probably didn't think about regret at all. Vlad didn't believe in forgiveness. He believed in permanence. And in a way, he got it. Every generation since has rewritten him. Tyrant, hero, monster, patriot, but none have erased him. That's its own kind of immortality. The wind sharpens as you turn back toward the hills. Snow whips sideways, stinging your face. The world narrows to white and motion. You keep walking, half blind, until you reach a small ridge where the land drops into shadow. You stop to catch your breath and glance back one last time. The plain below glows faintly under the last light. Quiet. Empty. Infinite. It doesn't look like a battlefield anymore, but then, neither did his life most days until you got close enough to hear the screaming. You think of all the contradictions that died with him. A tyrant who kept roads safe. A zealot who used fear as policy. A patriot who frightened his allies more than his enemies. You realize how impossible it is to separate cruelty from context when survival itself was cruelty's twin. Vlad was neither villain nor hero. He was geometry. Angles of necessity sharpened into something terrifyingly effective. As night closes in, you find a small chapel on the road to Snagov, its roof sagging under snow. You push the door open, and the hinges groan. Inside, a single candle burns before a crude icon of St. George slaying the dragon. You sit in the back pew, listening to the wind pressing against the walls. You think about how fitting it is that he joined the Order of the Dragon as a young man, sworn to fight evil, and then became the evil others used to fight. You realize that stories like his always circle back on themselves, devouring their own meaning. The candle flickers. The air smells faintly of wax and pine. You whisper, "They still talk about you, you know." The flame bends slightly, as if listening. They call you Dracula now, a monster, but also a man who wouldn't kneel. For a moment, the flame steadies. The wax drips once, and you swear the room feels warmer. Then it dims again, as if to say, legends don't reply. They just persist. You leave the chapel, and the cold greets you like an old friend. The snow under your boots glows faintly blue in the moonlight. The forest looms to your left, endless and quiet. Somewhere out there, perhaps under a forgotten tree or beneath a monastery floor, the remains of Vlad III sleep, or don't. You pull your cloak tighter, glance once more at the plain, and start walking north. Behind you, the wind shifts again, carrying that old familiar sound. Not the clatter of chains this time, but their absence. The kind of silence that means something once bound has finally been released. For centuries, poets, scholars, and filmmakers have tried to resurrect him with words, light, or rumor. Yet none of them ever managed to kill him either. Because you can't destroy what refuses to die properly. Maybe that's the real secret buried under this snow. That fear, once taught, never goes extinct. It just changes shape. You look back one last time, see the faint glow of the chapel window behind you, and whisper, "You won." Then you keep walking. The snow falls harder, the wind rises, and the plains stretch endlessly forward. Somewhere far away a wolf howls, long and low, and the sound rolls across the frozen land like applause from another century. The man is gone, but the idea remains, sharp as winter, patient as silence, and eternal as dread. The road to Snagov is narrow and crooked, threading through frozen marshes where mist crawls low over the reeds like tired smoke. You can smell the river long before you see it, iron and algae, cold and ancient. Somewhere beyond the gray horizon lies a small island, and on that island stands a monastery that has forgotten how to die. Locals say you can hear bells there on nights when no one is praying, and that sometimes, if the wind is right, the water itself murmurs in Old Wallachian. You walk along the bank slowly, and your boots sinking into frost-hardened mud, and the air feels thick enough to chew. It's strange how quiet the world becomes when history starts breathing nearby. You reach the ferry just as dusk begins its slow collapse into night. The boatman is old, white beard, eyes clouded, but still sharp enough to measure strangers. He nods once, wordless, as you climb aboard. The oars dip into the black water, and each pull sounds like the turning of a heavy page. The island grows larger with every stroke, its outline barely visible through fog. The monastery appears at last, a silhouette of walls, arches, and a single crooked bell tower leaning slightly to one side. The boatman mutters something about the wind being wrong tonight. You ask what he means, and he simply says, "It remembers." The boat scrapes against the shore, and you step onto frozen reeds. The monastery gates are open just enough for you to slip through. Inside, everything smells of candle wax, pine resin, and damp stone. The courtyard is small, enclosed by walls that have been patched so many times they look like a collage of centuries. Snow has settled unevenly on the steps leading to the chapel, each footprint from earlier visitors already half erased. You stand there for a moment, listening. The silence isn't empty. It's layered, as if filled with the faint hum of 1,000 unanswered prayers. Here's your anchor in the known record. Snagov Monastery, founded in the early 1400s, was long rumored to be Vlad III's burial site. A document from 1477, just a year after his death, lists the monastery as receiving royal funds for funerary maintenance. Yet, when archaeologists opened the tomb beneath the altar in 1930, expecting to find his remains, they discovered only bones of horses and fragments of armor. Some say grave robbers took the body centuries earlier. Others whisper that he never stayed buried at all. You look up at the chapel door and feel that old, unmistakable hum of possibility. The one that happens when fact and myth lean so close they start to breathe the same air. You push open the chapel door, and the hinges sigh like an exhausted confession. Inside, the air is thick and sweet with incense. Candles burn in uneven rows along the walls, their wax pooling like honey around the bases. The icons watch you from every surface. Christ, the Virgin, saints with eyes painted to follow you wherever you move. At the far end, a monk kneels before the altar, his head bowed. His robes are black, his hands folded, his stillness complete. You wait quietly until he finishes his prayer and turns. His face is lined and unreadable. "You have come about the prince," he says, as though you've been expected. You nod. The monk studies you for a moment before gesturing to the floor near the altar. "There," he says softly, "that's where they buried him, or tried to." You walk closer, the stone cold beneath your boots. The slab marking the grave is cracked down the middle, its engraving faded into obscurity. You crouch, touch the surface. It's colder than the air, colder than the river outside. "Do you believe he's here?" you ask. The monk shrugs. "He was never where people thought he'd be. That's how he lived. Why should death be different?" You stay kneeling, fingers brushing the cracked inscription. The monk's footsteps fade as he leaves you alone with the silence. Somewhere above, the bell creaks once in the tower, then stills again. You close your eyes and try to imagine that day, the funeral, if there even was one. Snow falling thick, the monks chanting psalms. The coffin lowered into earth that probably refused to stay closed. Maybe they sealed it quickly, praying he wouldn't notice. Maybe they buried fear itself that day and called it a man. There's a quirky tidbit from local folklore that says no grass grows directly over Vlad's true resting place because the ground there still breathes. Farmers crossing the marsh claim they sometimes see light flickering beneath the water, as if candles are burning beneath the mud. One fisherman swore he caught a glimpse of a pale face reflected in the river on Christmas Eve. A face that wasn't his. You glance toward the window, half expecting to see something moving beyond the glass, but the fog outside presses close like a curtain. You stand and begin to pace the chapel, your footsteps echoing softly. On one wall, a faded fresco shows the resurrection. Christ rising from the tomb, soldiers shielding their eyes from the light. But the face in the painting looks strangely familiar. Sharper jaw, thinner lips, eyes like polished iron. The artist might have painted faith, but you suspect he accidentally painted memory. You trace the edge of the fresco with your finger and feel the faint ridge where color meets stone. The irony isn't lost on you. An image of resurrection watching over a man who refuses to stay dead in legend. You step outside again. Night has thickened. The moon hangs over the lake like a coin too heavy to rise. The water is motionless, perfectly reflective, as if daring the sky to blink first. You walk toward the edge and crouch, watching your reflection ripple. For a moment, the water looks red, just a trick of the candlelight behind you. But still, it makes you shiver. You think about how every civilization invents one figure it can never completely forgive nor forget. Someone to carry the collective guilt of survival. Vlad became that for this land, the embodiment of what it takes to keep small kingdoms alive in the mouths of giants. The monk returns, holding 2 small cups of plum brandy. "It's cold," he says simply, You sit together on the steps, the drink burning warmth into your chest. "Do you think he was evil?" you ask. The monk chuckles quietly. "Evil?" He tilts his head. "No more than winter is evil. It kills so that something else can breathe." You nod slowly, the fire in your stomach spreading. The monk continues, his voice low. "They say he visits this place when the river freezes, stands on the ice, looking at the monastery lights. Never crosses, just watches." You smile faintly. "That sounds like him." The monk looks at you, eyes gleaming in the candlelight. "Perhaps that's why you're here, to be watched." You finish your drink, set the cup down, and walk once more to the chapel door. The monk stays behind, his silhouette melting into shadow. Inside, the candles burn lower, their flames steady despite the draft. You walk to the altar again, kneel and whisper. Not prayer exactly, but acknowledgement. "You got what you wanted," you murmur. They remember you. They argue, they fear, they build stories around your name like walls. You're not gone. You're homework for eternity. Here's where the open, scholarly debate re-enters, polite as always. Did Vlad's burial at Snagov actually happen, or was it a later invention by monks seeking royal association? Some scholars argue he was buried closer to Kumana, a monastery he founded earlier in life. Others say his body was moved posthumously by followers who feared desecration. The records contradict each other endlessly, an irony you suspect he would have loved. The ambiguity itself became the monument. A grave you can't prove is a legend that can't die. The candles flicker violently for a moment, then steady. You take that as your cue to leave. As you step outside, snow begins to fall, slowly at first, and then heavier, until the entire island seems to vanish inside it. The boatman waits by the shore, his lantern a small gold dot in the dark. You climb in, and he pushes off with a grunt. The river accepts you back without a sound. Midway across, he pauses, eyes fixed on something behind you. You turn, and there it is. A light in the monastery window. Faint, steady, undeniably there. You both watch it for a long time, the snow swirling around you, the water whispering against the hull. "The monks," you say softly. The boatman shakes his head. "They left hours ago." His voice is calm, almost reverent. He never liked company anyway. The light flickers once, twice, then disappears. The river resumes its gentle rhythm, as though nothing had happened. You reach the opposite bank, step onto solid ground, and look back one last time. The island is barely visible now, just a darker patch in the mist. The bell in the tower tolls once, low and slow. Not a warning, an acknowledgement. You start walking toward the road that leads back to Bucharest, the snow crunching underfoot. The trees on either side lean inward, as if eavesdropping. Somewhere behind you, far out on the lake, a ripple breaks the surface, spreading outward in perfect circles until it fades. By the time you reach the forest edge, dawn is brushing pale pink across the sky. The storm has passed. The world feels freshly minted. You stop, turn once more toward Snagov, and whisper, "Rest or don't. You've earned the choice." The air seems to warm for a moment before settling back into cold clarity. You realize, walking away, that this island, this entire land, doesn't need him buried. He's in the soil, in the rivers, in the superstition that keeps children indoors after dark. He's a country's uneasy heartbeat disguised as folklore. You reach a hill overlooking the river and pause, breath misting in the morning air. The monastery bell rings again, distant but clear, and for a moment you think you hear a second sound beneath it. a low, familiar rhythm, like chains gently swaying underwater. Then it's gone, replaced by birdsong and the rustle of thawing branches. You smile, because even ghosts need to stretch after sleeping too long. You keep walking, the path curving toward the waking city. Smoke begins to rise from distant chimneys, and the scent of bread drifts on the breeze. Life, oblivious and unstoppable. You glance once more toward the river, where the mist thins enough to reveal the faint outline of the island. The monastery gleams under the first sunlight, peaceful, ordinary, unbothered by its own legend. But you know better. You know that somewhere beneath those stones, in whatever form he chose to take, the prince is still watching, silent, amused, and entirely unrepentant. And as the sun climbs higher, washing the world in light, you realize that's how all true monsters win. Not by living forever, but by teaching the land itself to remember their name. The path back to the castle winds like a memory through the forest, slick with morning frost and echoing with invisible wings. You walk slower this time, not because you're tired, but because the world around you feels fragile, like glass about to crack under the weight of its own history. The mist rises again from the river, curling around the trees as though it knows where you've been. Behind you, Snagoff fades into distance and rumor, its monastery shrinking into a pale bruise on the horizon. Ahead lies Poenari, broken fortress on a cliff that still wears Vlad's ghost like a crown. You keep walking, breath shallow, footsteps careful, because this isn't just another ruin on a hill. It's the place where the story began to realize it would never end. When you reach the base of the mountain, the climb looks impossible. The old wooden stairs twist upward into cloud, uneven, soaked with ice. Each step, a small negotiation with gravity. The locals say there are 1,480 of them, one for every week of Vlad's life. You start counting as you climb, but lose track after 50. The forest grows darker, the air thinner. Somewhere between the rustle of branches and the creak of old wood, you begin to hear something else. Chains. Faint, rhythmic, metallic, as if the mountain itself remembers restraint. You stop, listen, it fades. You start climbing again. By the time you reach the top, your lungs burn and your legs shake. But the world below looks weightless, all fog and silver rivers. The fortress itself is a skeleton of stone. What remains of its towers jut like teeth from the ridge, the walls cracked open to the sky. Snow fills the courtyards where soldiers once drilled, and wind moves through the corridors like breath through a flute. You walk through the arched gate, past the half-collapsed watchtower, and step into the inner keep. Here, history smells of rust and rain. You brush your hand along the wall. The stone is slick and cold, slick enough to reflect the faint light like wet skin. Somewhere in these ruins, according to every legend worth repeating, lie the chains. Vlad's chains, the ones he ordered to be built beneath his own castle, so that no prisoner could forget whose mercy they lived under. Here's your anchor in the factual world. The castle at Poenari was rebuilt by Vlad III at around 1459 as a stronghold against Ottoman invasion and rebellious boyars. He used forced labor, nobles captured after a failed uprising, to carry the stones up the mountain. Chronicles claim many died doing it, though records from that era blur truth and vengeance into the same ink. When the fortress was finished, it became a symbol of his will, isolation, endurance, control. Standing here now, centuries later, You can feel that was still humming underfoot. The mountain itself seems complicit. You descend into what remains of the lower chambers. The entrance to the dungeons is half buried by rubble, but there's a narrow crack wide enough to slip through. The air changes instantly. Colder, denser, metallic. Your breath fogs in the dark, and the sound of dripping water becomes a heartbeat. You light your small lantern, and the beam cuts through centuries of dust to reveal stone walls veined with ice. Chains hang from iron rings in the ceiling, their rust shimmering like old blood in the dim light. You stand very still, listening. The air feels alive here, as if the walls are exhaling. It's easy to imagine what this room once was. The prisoners waiting in silence, the air thick with their fear. The echo of boots on stone before the door opened. Vlad, standing above them, saying little, his expression unreadable. He didn't need words. Silence was enough to unmake a man. You walk farther in, the lantern swinging, and spot something curious, a faint carving on the far wall. You brush away the frost. It's a dragon. Crude but unmistakable. Above it, someone has etched a line of Cyrillic letters, half erased. Even chains break for the right cause. You smile. Maybe it's graffiti left by a prisoner, maybe by a guard, maybe even by him. The kind of joke only eternity finds funny. There's a fringe tidbit in local lore that says the chains in Poenari were not meant only for others. Some monks claimed Vlad had a set forged for himself, heavy, ornate, worn during his prayers as a symbol of humility. The story goes that he would lock himself in the lower chamber on certain nights, fast, and meditate among the echoes of the condemned. To remember who holds power and who is held by it, he supposedly said. Historians call this apocryphal. Priests call it plausible. You stand in the dark and try to imagine that scene. A ruler surrounded by shadows of his own making, choosing to sit among them, unarmed. Whether true or not, the idea itself feels right for him. Devotion and domination, tangled like twin vines. You set the lantern on the ground and sit beside it. The silence here is so dense it almost hums. You wonder if this is what immortality feels like. Not glory, not peace, just the endless sound of your own story replaying in stone. You run your fingers along the floor, where moisture gathers in small puddles, and find the faint outline of what might once have been a footprint pressed into the stone itself. You trace it absently and think, maybe history doesn't preserve us for remembrance. Maybe it just traps us for entertainment. After a while, you climb back up, the light dimming behind you. The sky has turned the color of tarnished silver. From the parapet, the world spreads endlessly in mist and shadow. You can see the Argus River winding below, threading through the valleys like a scar. The wind bites through your coat, but it feels cleansing. You close your eyes, listen again, and there it is, the soft clink of chains below. You don't look for the source. Some sounds are better left unlocated. Here's where the open scholarly debate unfolds, tangled and unsolved. Was Vlad's cruelty a symptom of sadism or a strategy of governance? Did he enjoy fear, or did he simply understand its efficiency? Historians argue endlessly, citing chronicles that contradict one another like jealous siblings. Some say he believed terror to be the purest form of order. Others suggest he saw it as justice, an equalizer between peasant and noble, soldier and thief. You stand at the edge of the wall and watch the clouds slide across the horizon, thinking maybe both were true. in an age where mercy was weakness, cruelty was currency, and he spent it precisely. You walk along the rampart, careful not to slip on the icy stones. The wind rushes through the cracks in the walls, producing a low, resonant moan that almost sounds human. You stop, lean against the parapet, and glance down. The drop is dizzying, a sheer cliff plunging into fog. Wairo legend says he built his castle here for that reason alone, so that enemies would be forced to approach from below, always under his gaze. You can see why. Even the sky seems lower here, submissive. The sun begins to set, spilling orange light through the gaps in the clouds. For a moment, the walls glow gold, as if pretending to be whole again. You walk to the highest tower, climb the last set of stairs, and find yourself standing where he once stood, where Vlad might have looked out at his world, trying to convince himself it was enough. You can almost feel him beside you, quiet, calculating, the air charged with intention. If ghosts exist, they must live in pauses like this, between breath and thought, between empire and memory. You sit on the edge of the tower, legs dangling, eyes fixed on the endless gray below. Somewhere down there, centuries have buried the bones of men who built this place, fought for it, died in its shadow. You imagine them whispering still, wondering whether their labor made them prisoners or immortals. It's hard to tell the difference when both last this long. You think about all the times this story has been retold, by German pamphleteers, painting him as a monster, by Romanian poets calling him a patriot, by Hollywood turning him into a vampire who thirsts not for justice but for melodrama. You chuckle softly. He would have hated the fangs. Too decorative. The cold deepens, but you don't leave yet. Instead, you let your mind drift. You picture him not as the impaler, not even as the prince, but as a man standing here one night long ago, listening to the wind scrape across the stones. Maybe he felt small for once, the way all rulers must when the world goes quiet. Maybe he wondered if fear truly keeps a kingdom safe, or just postpones its fall. Maybe he realized that the same chains he forged for others had slowly fastened around him too. You whisper into the wind. Did you ever sleep, Vlad? The silence that follows feels like a nod. As night falls, the last light fades from the walls, and the fortress becomes part of the mountain again. You descend slowly, the steps slick with frost, the world below glowing faintly with the first lights of villages waking for evening. You stop halfway down, turn back. The castle looms above like a thought refusing to dissolve. The chains you heard earlier seem to echo again, faint, steady, almost tender now, like lullabies for stone. You think about how history works. It takes cruelty and polishes it into curiosity. It turns nightmares into tourism. But somewhere beneath all the retelling, the truth hums, quiet but persistent. Every empire is just a series of cages built to outlast their captors. Vlad's mistake, or maybe his triumph, was that his cage worked too well. It kept him in the world long after he left it. He reached the base of the mountain just as the moon clears the clouds. The path home stretches pale and empty. You pause, look back one final time, and see the castle glowing faintly under the moonlight. The broken walls catching silver like veins. The chains, you realize, were never just metal. They were the invisible links between fear and memory, between power and loneliness, between the ruler and the ruled. And they're still here, rattling softly in every story told about him. You start walking down the valley road. The river hums alongside you. The stars bright enough to trace the old constellations of soldiers, dragons, saints. You feel lighter now, as though the mountain took something from you in exchange for understanding. The air warms as you descend, and the scent of pine gives way to earth and smoke. You realize the night doesn't feel haunted anymore. It feels inhabited. When you reach the clearing at the base, you stop and sit on a fallen log. The castle is distant now, half swallowed by fog, its silhouette barely visible. You close your eyes, exhale slowly, and let the sounds of the forest wrap around you. Wind through branches, water against rock, the faint chime of metal from somewhere far above. You imagine those chains swaying gently in the dark, unfastened at last, each echo a small surrender. Your thoughts slow. The world softens. The air grows heavy and kind. Maybe this is how legends end, not with fire or applause, but with exhaustion, with the world quietly agreeing to remember. You lie back on the cold ground, the stars scattered above you like spilled salt, and feel the mountain breathing faintly beneath you. The story that began in birth, bled through power, and drowned in rumor has finally circled back to stillness. The dragon sleeps again, chained not by fear but by peace. The wind sighs one last time through the valley, brushing your hair like a lullaby. The castle disappears completely into mist. The night deepens into silence so complete it feels like forgiveness. And as your eyes drift closed, you hear the faintest whisper, chains loosening, not breaking, a sound of release rather than restraint. Everything grows softer. The light, the air, the memory. The story exhales. You let yourself sink into that